Tonight, beneath a sky veiled in soft, drifting clouds, we open a quiet doorway into a world where history breathes in whispers rather than echoes. A gentle rain. Over the Somme is a story of weary soldiers, fading lanterns, and the unexpected peace that can be found even in the heart of the turmoil. Tonight, you'll step into a landscape where raindrops fall like blessings, where memories linger in the mist, and where hope glows faintly but faithfully, guiding those who wander through it. Before we begin, if you're joining us from the U.S., late at night, or settling down in Europe during the calm hours before bed, or listening from Canada early in the morning, or anywhere else in the world, take a moment to let me know in the comments what time you're watching. And if you enjoy these slow, atmospheric journeys, please like, subscribe, and share your thoughts below. Your support helps keep these nightly stories alive. Now, find a comfortable position. Let your breathing settle. Let the tensions of the day slip quietly away. Prepare your mind for a gentle descent into a world of rain, earth, distant horizons, and soft-spoken courage. When you're ready, we will begin. The first drops fell so lightly that most of the men didn't notice them at all. They drifted down like tiny beads of cool silver, settling on helmets, darkening patches of soil, and tapping softly against abandoned tin cups resting on the wooden duckboards. Along the winding trenches of the Somme, the evening air shifted, growing cooler, calmer, as though the sky itself wished to hush the world beneath it. Private Emmett Harrow had been sitting alone at the edge of a shallow dugout, his back against a damp sandbag, his fingers absently tracing the frayed edge of a photograph folded into his pocket. He heard the rain before he felt it, a soft patter, gentle and rhythmic, like someone knocking politely on a distant door. He lifted his gaze just as a mist began to gather, its fine droplets catching what little light the fading dusk still offered. The battlefield before him, so often harsh and jagged with noise, seemed to exhale. The far-off tree line blurred behind the curtain of moisture. Pools of water formed slow, rippling circles where stray shells had carved shallow hollows into the earth. Even the mud, thick, clinging, ever-present, loosened slightly under the touch of the falling rain, as though nature wished to soothe the very ground. All around him men moved quietly. A few tilted their faces upward, feeling the sky brush their skin. Others tightened coats or adjusted packs, but even those motions felt slower than usual, gentler. The rain softened everything it touched, dulling sharp edges of wood and metal, dampening the dust that clung stubbornly to uniforms. It felt like a balm, a reminder that even here, amid shadows and weariness, the world could still offer moments of tenderness. Emmett took a long breath. The scent of petrichor rose from the earth, layered with smoke, wet canvas, and something faintly sweet he couldn't quite place. For the first time that day, his shoulders eased. He closed his eyes, letting the raindrops cool his face. Each one seemed to steady him, grounding him, promising quietly that the night ahead, though uncertain, might unfold with just a little more peace. Somewhere beyond the trench walls, a lone bird called out, its song carried in the drifting mist. The sound was soft, fragile, almost impossibly hopeful amid the stillness. Emmett listened, imagining the bird perched in some hidden branch, feathers puffed against the weather, singing not out of joy but out of persistence. He felt something stir in his chest, a memory, maybe, or simply the smallest spark of comfort. The Somme had taken so much already, but tonight, under the sheltering rain, it seemed to offer something back. The rain deepened as night crept slowly across the scarred landscape, thickening into a soft veil that wrapped itself around every beam of fading light. In the trench, lanterns began to glow one by one, their warm amber flickers blurring into halos as the mist curled lazily around them. The gentle pattering above blended with the distant hum of wind, creating a lullaby that seemed to hush even the most restless thoughts. Emmett watched Corporal Lenton struggle briefly with a stubborn lantern, wick before it finally caught, blooming with a trembling flame. That glow pushed back the darkness only by an arm's reach, but in this place, even small pockets of light felt like sanctuaries. Shadows softened. The air warmed ever so slightly. The men's faces, normally hardened by exhaustion, seemed more human in the muted glow, smoothed by gold and softened by the drifting mist. The trench walls glistened where the rain traced slow paths down their slopes, gathering into rivulets that fed the earth below. Wooden planks creaked under shifting boots, their swelling fibers sighing from the steady damp. Emmett pulled his coat tighter, feeling its weight cling to him, though not unpleasantly. The rain had a way of settling everything: cloth, soil, breath, even the swirling chaos of the mind. A few feet away, two soldiers spoke in low murmurs about nothing in particular: bread gone stale, socks that never dried, a story someone swore they heard about a horse wandering through no man's land at dawn. Their voices were slow, thoughtful, unhurried. Rain had that effect. It made everything feel like it belonged to a quieter world. Emmett turned his attention upward, though the sky was nearly invisible, hidden behind the low-hanging curtain of clouds. Every now and then a brighter patch appeared, hinting at the moon's presence behind its shroud. It cast a faint milky glow that mingled with the lanterns below, making the mist shimmer like drifting silver threads. Somewhere toward the end of the trench, a harmonica began to play, soft, uncertain notes at first, then gradually forming a tune. It wasn't cheerful, nor was it sorrowful. It was something in between, like a memory being hummed back into existence. The notes floated through the damp air, bending around corners, weaving themselves into the rhythm of the rain. Emmett felt the music settle into him, loosening the last knots of tension along his spine. He thought of home, of warm lamplight spilling through the kitchen window, the smell of rain-soaked leaves on the family porch, his mother's voice calling him inside before the evening chill set in. Those images drifted to him gently, not as sharp pangs of longing, but as soft, steady reminders of a world still waiting somewhere far beyond the horizon. For a long moment he simply breathed, slow, deep, unhurried. In the mist-filled quiet of the Somme, beneath lanterns flickering like small, determined stars, he felt something fragile, but real. The sense that tonight, at least, the world wished to let them rest. As the night deepened, the rain eased into a steadier, more rhythmic fall, soft enough to soothe, yet heavy enough to reshape the air with its presence. The scent rising from the soaked earth became fuller, richer, carrying with it layers of soil, moss, old timber, and the faintest touch of something floral drifting from unseen wildflowers far beyond the trenches. It was a scent that seemed ancient, as though it had been waiting beneath the dust and dryness for a chance to breathe again. Emmett inhaled slowly, letting that earthy fragrance settle into him. It carried a strange comfort, a grounding reminder that even here, surrounded by the harshness of war, nature continued its cycle with calm indifference. Mud became soft, roots drank deeply, and the world for a moment felt less jagged. The trench floor, slick with water, reflected small pools of lantern glow, Each step made a muted squelch, but even that sound blended seamlessly with the rain's gentle cadence. The men walked more slowly now, not out of weariness alone, but because the environment itself seemed to ask for gentler movement. The night invited stillness, and the soldiers responded instinctively. A few men gathered near the cooking area where a pot of thin broth warmed over a low flame. The rising steam carried a simple aroma, onions, a hint of salt, and the unmistakable scent of wet uniforms steaming in the heat. They cupped their hands around metal mugs, letting the warmth seep into chilled fingers. No one spoke much. Conversation had narrowed to nods, soft chuckles, or the quiet sharing of spoonfuls with those who arrived late. Emmett accepted a ladle of broth and sat on an overturned crate near the trench wall. The rain formed a curtain just inches in front of him, beating gently on the brim of his helmet before dripping onto the wooden planks. He sipped slowly, the warmth spreading through him, loosening the tightness in his chest. Somewhere down the line, Sergeant Keene passed by, his boots leaving shallow impressions in the mud. He paused briefly, lifting his chin toward the sky as though listening to something far off. The rain seemed to settle more heavily around him, and for a moment the entire trench felt held in a fragile balance, quiet, steady, suspended between the weight of the past and the uncertainty of tomorrow. A faint breeze drifted through, carrying with it a new scent, damp grass perhaps, or the lingering sweetness of crushed clover hidden beyond the trench walls. Emmett let it brush over him, feeling as though the world beyond the mud and wire had stepped just a little closer, offering a whisper of reassurance. He glanced at the photograph still tucked safely in his pocket, but didn't take it out. Tonight, the memories it held came to him gently on their own. He felt them in the rain, in the soft gloom of lantern light, in the grounding scent of earth that reminded him of fields far from here, fields untouched by war, growing freely under kinder skies. The night at the Somme was still heavy, still uncertain, but beneath the falling rain, something within it softened, and for the men waiting quietly in its embrace, that softness mattered more than they could ever say. The rain had settled into a steady, calming rhythm, the kind that seemed to smooth the rough edges of the world and hush even the most restless thoughts. In that softened atmosphere, footsteps began to echo faintly through the trench, not hurried or anxious, but measured, deliberate, carrying a sense of unspoken purpose. Each step pressed into the mud with a soft, yielding sound, as though the earth itself was welcoming the slow movement. Emmett lifted his gaze from the fading steam of his empty mug and listened. The footsteps belonged to Lieutenant Rowan, a man whose presence always seemed to carry a quiet gravity. He walked with his coat buttoned high against the damp, his collar glistening with beads of rain. The lantern light caught on his boots as he passed, briefly revealing the deep lines beneath his eyes. Though he moved with discipline, the gentle rain seemed to soften even him, making his steps gentler, almost reflective. Rowan paused now and then to speak with a soldier, placing a steadying hand on a shoulder or offering a small nod of reassurance. His voice was low, nearly lost in the mist, but its tone carried warmth. The men responded with half smiles, respectful yet comforted. In this place, gestures mattered far more than words. As he approached, Emmett straightened slightly, though Rowan's expression remained calm, almost kind. The lieutenant gave a small nod in greeting, then reached for the lantern hanging just above Emmett's head. With a practiced twist, he adjusted the wick, making the flame burn brighter and steadier. Its light expanded in a warm circle, illuminating droplets hanging in the air like tiny, suspended gems. "Better to keep the dark pushed back," Rowan murmured, not expecting a reply. Emmett simply nodded. There was a strange comfort in the lieutenant's presence, a quiet reminder that leadership could be gentle, not merely firm. When Rowan moved on, his footsteps receded into the soft rainfall, blending with other faint sounds. A shovel scraping lightly as someone adjusted sandbags, the murmur of men settling into their dugouts, the distant rustle of canvas flaps shifting in the breeze. These small noises formed a kind of slow-moving tapestry, woven from the routines that kept them grounded. Emmett found himself rising to walk a little, letting his feet follow the familiar path along the trench wall. The boards beneath him were slick but stable, and each step brought a subtle squish of softened mud. The rain tapped steadily against his helmet, rolling down its metal curves in thin rivulets before sliding onto his coat. He welcomed the sensation, the coolness, the softness, the rhythm. It was grounding, meditative. He passed a group of soldiers quietly playing cards under the protection of a stretched tarp. The tarp sagged slightly with pooled rainwater, but the men seemed unconcerned, their voices hushed as they placed cards with slow deliberation. Lantern light reflected off the wet surface like ripples of amber across a pond. One soldier hummed idly, not quite a tune, but enough to thread their small gathering with a sense of fragile normalcy. Further ahead, the trench opened slightly into a wider space where crates had been stacked into makeshift seating. There, Private Morley sat sharpening a small pocket knife, not with urgency, but with the calm focus of a man seeking quiet occupation. The rhythmic scrape of metal on stone blended with the rain's steady song, creating a kind of soft duet. Emmett continued moving until he reached the far edge of the trench, where the boards narrowed and the darkness deepened. Beyond this point lay the path towards the forward line, but tonight no orders called them there. Tonight the quiet reigned. He stood there for a moment, letting the stillness settle over him. The air felt thick with mist and possibility, like the night was holding its breath, waiting for something gentle, something healing to unfold. Beyond the lip of the trench, the world stretched into a quiet, shadowed expanse. No man's land, usually a place of sharp danger and harsh silhouettes, had softened under the falling rain. The landscape, scarred by craters and tangled wire, seemed wrapped in a delicate haze, as though someone had draped a translucent veil over all its broken edges. Emmett stood near the narrow overlook, his hands resting lightly on the damp wood. He peered into the mist, his breath forming faint clouds that drifted upward and vanished into the night. The rain dampened the distant horizon, turning it into a muted watercolor of grays and soft blacks. Shapes that normally appeared stark, splintered posts, rusted fragments, half-buried helmets, now blurred, blending into one continuous landscape of gentle contours. It was strangely beautiful. A faint glimmer caught his eye, small beads of rain collecting on barbed wire, forming fragile droplets that clung for moments before falling soundlessly into the mud below. The wire itself, usually harsh and menacing, seemed like an abandoned instrument now, its cruel edges softened by the glow of lantern light, diffusing through the mist behind him. Every drop of rain held a tiny reflection, a fleeting spark that disappeared the moment gravity pulled it free. A soft wind drifted across the field, rustling through patches of wild grass that had somehow managed to grow among the shattered earth. The blade swayed in slow, rhythmic arcs, brushing against puddles that formed gentle ripples. It reminded Emmett of the meadows back home, distant but not forgotten, where rain meant life, not tension. Behind him, the faint murmur of the trench continued, the low hum of conversation, the occasional clink of a canteen, the steady footsteps of the watch patrol. But here, at the boundary between safety and uncertainty, the world felt suspended, as though time itself had chosen to linger, hesitant to move forward. A flash of movement caught his attention, a small field mouse darting across a patch of wet earth. It paused briefly near a shallow puddle, its tiny whiskers trembling as it drank. The sight filled Emmett with a strangely warm ache. Even here, in a place shaped by conflict, life persisted with delicate stubbornness. The rain continued to fall, creating a soothing symphony. Gentle patters on canvas, soft plinks on metal. The occasional heavier drop splashing into a crater. The sound traveled across the deserted field like a lullaby, whispered by the clouds themselves. Emmett let the rhythm settle into him, each drop easing the tension he carried in his shoulders. A faint light flickered far across the field, perhaps another trench's lantern, dimmed by distance and weather. It shimmered for a moment, then faded behind a curtain of rain, leaving the night once again wrapped in muted stillness. Emmett exhaled slowly. The air tasted clean, almost sweet, with a hint of something he hadn't felt in a long time, possibility. The battlefield seemed quieter than it had been in weeks. No explosions, no shouts, only rain, earth, and the steady breath of a world healing itself in small, quiet moments. For a brief stretch of time, no man's land did not feel like a void between enemies. It felt like a resting place, an open field where the night gathered its courage and the rain offered its gentle blessing. When Emmett returned deeper into the trench, the rain still whispered its steady rhythm overhead, but the lantern light had grown warmer, brighter, and somehow more intimate. Several soldiers had gathered near the supply alcove where the day's mail, delayed by weather and shifting lines, had finally arrived. The letters were stacked neatly in a wooden crate, edges curled slightly from the damp, ink smudged in places where raindrops had kissed the paper. Even before he reached the group, Emmett could feel the shift in the air. The men huddled around the crate were quieter, gentler, each one holding a small envelope with reverence. Some smiled faintly. Others stared long at the return addresses, their eyes misting with memories stirred awake. Letters from home were not simply messages. They were anchors, reminders of a life beyond the mud and uncertainty. Private Morley opened his with careful fingers, unfolding the paper as though it were something fragile and sacred. A soft chuckle escaped him, light, warm, almost disbelieving, at whatever words danced across the page. He pressed it briefly to his chest before continuing to read, the lantern glow illuminating his softened expression. Corporal Lenton sat nearby, his letter unopened, but held tightly in both hands. He traced the edges of the envelope over and over, as if feeling its weight could tell him the story inside. Emmett understood that feeling well. Sometimes anticipation was its own kind of comfort. Emmett himself had not expected mail tonight, yet as he approached, Sergeant Keene waved him over with a small nod. "Harrow," he said softly, pulling a thin envelope from the crate. "For you." The sergeant's voice was subdued, respectful of the hush that had settled over the trench. The paper was damp along one corner where it had brushed against another wet surface, but his name was still clearly written in familiar handwriting. Emmett's breath caught. It was from his sister. He recognized the looping way she wrote his initials, the tiny flourish at the end of his surname. Finding a quiet spot beneath a canvas overhang, he sat down and opened the envelope slowly, careful not to tear the softened edges. The letter unfolded gently, its creases relaxing under his fingers. Her words, written in neat lines, carried a warmth that reached him instantly. "We miss you every day, Emmett. The fields are turning green again. The rain last week smelled just like spring used to when you and I would race down the hill behind the mill. I hope wherever you are, the rain brings you comfort too." He paused, closing his eyes. The sounds around him softened, the hush of the rain, the quiet breaths of the men reading their own letters, the distant hum of wind threading through the narrow passageways. For a moment, it felt as though his sister's voice was right beside him, whispering her message through the mist. He continued reading. "Mama lights a candle for you every evening. She says its flame reminds her of your stubborn spirit, that no storm could put you out." A smile touched his lips. He had forgotten how vividly she described things, how her words always painted not just a picture, but a feeling. The letter went on to describe small moments: a neighbor's new foal, a batch of bread that burned on the edges, the warm scent of lilac bushes budding early that year. Ordinary things, but in their simplicity they wrapped around him like a soft quilt. As he finished the final lines, Emmett folded the letter carefully and slipped it into his coat pocket, close to his heart. The warmth it brought seemed to radiate outward, mingling with the gentle chill of the rain-cooled night. Around him, other soldiers were still caught in their own quiet worlds, reading and rereading the words of loved ones. A few wiped their eyes discreetly. One man kissed the corner of his letter before tucking it inside his tunic. Another held his envelope to his forehead, as though offering a prayer. The trench felt different now, less like a place forged in conflict and more like a sanctuary built from shared longing, memories, and the delicate threads of connection that stretched across oceans and borders. Rain fell softly on the canvas above, tapping a rhythm like patient fingers on a lullaby drum. Tonight, letters had become lanterns of their own, small, flickering lights helping the men find warmth in the vast dark around them. The rain eased into a gentler drizzle as the night deepened, its soft cadence blending seamlessly into the quiet murmur of the trench. The letters had settled something inside the men, an unseen calm, a glow that warmed the air even as the temperature dropped. It was as if the whole line exhaled together, releasing tension that had been wound tight for days. Emmett remained under the canvas overhang for a few minutes longer, feeling the steady rhythm of the rain through the fabric overhead. The scent of wet earth still lingered, mingling with the faint sweetness of the candle Sergeant Keene had lit near the center of the trench. The flame burned low but sure, sheltering beneath a small glass jar that kept the draft at bay. He watched as the men around him tucked their letters into pockets, boots, and folded shirt linings, each man choosing a place close to the heart. Their expressions were softer now, their shoulders lowered, their eyes distant with reflection. Even the usual banter fell away, replaced by gentle nods and a quiet communion that didn't require words. For a few rare moments, the war felt far away. Emmett rose and stepped toward the narrow walkway where droplets of rain clung to the boards like silver beads. He walked slowly, letting each footstep fall with deliberate softness. The mist muffled sound, turning the world into a cocoon of cool breath and drifting light. Lanterns glowed from small recesses in the trench walls, their flames quivering like tired stars. As he walked, he felt a strange warmth settle over him, a truce not between armies, but within himself, the constant pressure at his ribs, the knot that lived beneath his sternum, loosened. He was not free from fear. No soldier here was. But tonight, with the rain falling gently and the letters tucked safely against their chests, fear felt less sharp. It was softened, wrapped in a layer of calm woven from memory and hope. He paused as he passed Private Lenton, who sat with his back against the trench wall, staring upward at the dark sky. Raindrops fell onto his face, tracing lines down his cheeks, but he made no effort to wipe them away. His eyes were distant, thoughtful. "Quiet night," Emmett said softly. Lenton nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. "Feels like the world's remembering how to breathe." Emmett offered a small smile. "Yeah, it does." They stayed in silence for a moment, listening to the gentle patter of rain on canvas and wood. Somewhere far down the line, a kettle lid rattled softly, steam hissing in a slow, steady sigh. The scent of boiled water, simple, clean, drifted through the trench. Further along, Lieutenant Rowan moved with slow, deliberate steps, checking on the men without disturbing their peace. He paused occasionally, offering a nod or a few quiet words before continuing. The glow from his lantern cast a warm halo around him, making his silhouette seem softer, like something carved from patience rather than command. Emmett continued his walk, each step sinking with his breath. His thoughts were gentle now, drifting from memory to observation with the ease of a leaf carried on a slow-moving stream. He thought of home again, of rain tapping against the windowsill of his childhood bedroom, of lying awake at night listening to storms move across the hills. He had always found comfort in rain, its rhythm, its honesty, its ability to wash the world clean for a moment. Tonight, the Somme felt washed clean too, if only in spirit. The air felt lighter. No distant booms troubled the horizon. No sudden shouts broke the quiet. Just rain, letters, warm lantern light, and the shared heartbeat of men who, for a fleeting stretch of time, were allowed to feel human again. He closed his eyes briefly, letting the peace settle through him like a slow exhale. A brief truce, fragile, quiet, but real, had formed within the hearts of the soldiers. And in that truce, under the gentle rain, they found something they all desperately needed, a moment of rest. The night had grown thick and velvety, wrapped in layers of mist and rainfall that softened every edge of the trench. Emmett had begun to sense something shifting in the air, not a change he could see yet, but one he could feel, like a slow awakening beneath the horizon. Dawn was still far off, but its earliest breath had begun to whisper through the darkness. The mist, once heavy and low, started to lift in delicate strands, rising like pale smoke above the sandbags. Lantern light filtered through it in soft halos, giving the trench the quiet appearance of an old sanctuary where weary souls might rest. Shadows stretched gently along the walls, lengthening and blending, creating shapes that moved as calmly as drifting clouds. Emmett leaned on the wooden railing, running his fingers across the damp grain. The wood was swollen slightly from the rain, its texture soft and almost warm to the touch. The scent of wet earth had deepened overnight, becoming richer and more soothing. It mixed with the faint aroma of last night's broth, the lingering sweetness of candle wax, and the mineral tang of rain on metal. Some soldiers, too tired to remain upright, had slipped into quiet sleep. They lay curled under whatever scraps of dry canvas they could find, boots still on, helmets resting beside them. Their breaths rose and fell in steady rhythm, blending with the rain's whisper. Even in exhaustion, their faces looked peaceful, softened by the mist, free of the strained daylight often imposed. Others remained awake, sitting with knees drawn up and arms wrapped loosely around themselves, not from cold, though the night air carried a gentle chill, but from contemplation. These hours, suspended between darkness and dawn, offered space for thoughts that daytime rarely allowed. Hopes, fears, memories, dreams, all drifted more easily in the hush of the rain. Private Morley sat across from Emmett, his shoulders slumped but his expression serene. He was humming again, soft, tuneless notes that floated like feathers through the trench. His eyes were half closed and his breath seemed to match the rain's rhythm. Emmett listened, letting the sound settle in the quiet spaces of his mind. Farther down, a pair of soldiers shared a blanket, keeping each other warm in the practical way trench life required. One leaned back against the wall, head tilted toward the sky as though searching for the first hint of dawn. The other rested with his chin on his chest, drifting somewhere between sleep and reverie. Their lantern sat between them, its flame steady and bright. Lieutenant Rowan had paused his rounds and now stood at the trench's narrow opening, peering into the rain-soaked world beyond. His figure was partially obscured by the drifting mist, giving him an almost ethereal presence. He held his lantern low, the light spreading across the boards like a soft, golden blanket. Emmett wondered what the lieutenant thought about during these quiet hours, whether leadership weighed heavily on him, or whether he too found solace in the gentleness of the rain. The sounds of the night had changed as well. The drip of water from canvas edges had become slower, steadier. The rustle of uniforms had quieted as more soldiers settled into rest. Even the distant wind had softened into a low, constant sigh, weaving through the tangled wire above like a thread drawn through fabric. Emmett felt the approach of dawn like a hand resting lightly on his shoulder, gentle, reassuring. It didn't promise sunshine or warmth, only the slow lifting of darkness, the gradual return of light to a world that desperately needed it. Yet even that small promise felt precious. He closed his eyes and breathed deeply, letting the cool, misty air fill his lungs. Somewhere within him, a quiet strength stirred. Not the loud, forceful kind demanded by battle, but a quieter resilience, soft, steady, born from nights like this when the world seemed willing to hold its breath and allow peace a moment to exist. As he exhaled, he felt the heaviness in his limbs loosen, replaced by a gentle calm. Dawn was not yet here, but it was coming. Emmett stepped away from the main walkway of the trench and moved toward one of the small lookout points that jutted slightly above the sandbags. The mist lifted just enough for him to see the faint shape of the land beyond, a gentle undulation of earth marked by scattered craters. Under the soft rain, those craters had filled with water, turning them into shallow pools that reflected the dim glow of distant lanterns, like fragments of a broken sky. He rested his elbows on the wet wood and gazed out. Each crater seemed like a quiet world unto itself, still reflective, untouched by movement. The ripples caused by the falling raindrops spread outward in delicate circles, overlapping, merging, then smoothing again into silence. They reminded Emmett of the stories his grandmother used to tell, stories of ancient spirits that whispered through water, carrying secrets only the patient could hear. Tonight, the battlefield felt almost alive with those whispers. He imagined each crater speaking softly, retelling the history of the land, not in words, but in the gentle tremor of raindrops and the shifting patterns on its mirrored surface. Stories of trees that once stood tall, of fields that once swayed with golden crops, of footsteps long before soldiers marched through. The rain, persistent and tender, felt like an old friend returning to soothe the earth, washing it with a kind of quiet forgiveness. Emmett wasn't sure why, but he found himself drawn to the farthest crater, the largest one, where the water was still enough to reflect a blurry impression of the sky. He remembered standing beside calm rivers in his childhood, tossing stones and watching the ripples stretch like threads across the surface. The memory brought a faint smile to his lips, warming him from within even as the cool mist brushed his skin. To his right, a low conversation murmured between two soldiers on early watch duty. Their voices were soft, their silhouettes blurred by the drifting mist. Every now and then, their laughter rose in brief, muffled bursts, gentle, weary, but real. Emmett felt grateful for those small sparks of warmth. It was strange how laughter could still exist in places like this, growing stubbornly like a wildflower in cracked stone. The rain continued its restless patter, falling on canvas, water, and mud alike, blending the world into a single, harmonious rhythm. It was almost hypnotic. Emmett felt his muscles loosen again, his breath deepen, his thoughts stretch out like limbs waking from deep sleep. He leaned farther forward, listening as the droplets danced across the crater pools. A faint rhythmic tapping echoed from one of the far craters, a sound distinct from the rain. Curious, Emmett leaned slightly more to the side and squinted through the mist. It wasn't a threat. Rather, it was a small bird perched at the crater's edge, pecking gently at the water's surface. Its feathers were soaked, but it stood steadily, dipping its beak as though grateful for the rain's offering. The sight touched something deep within him. Here was a tiny creature, oblivious to the scars around it, surviving quietly, seeking nourishment from the very water that softened the battlefield. Life persisted even in the quietest corners. Emmett whispered under his breath, a simple thought carried into the rain. May we all be that strong. The bird fluttered its wings once, scattering droplets into the air like tiny sparks. Then it hopped along the edge of the crater, shaking off the rain in a small burst of movement before settling again. Behind him he heard Lieutenant Rowan's calm footsteps approaching. Not the urgent stride of command, but the steady, deliberate pace he used during the quiet hours. Emmett didn't turn right away. He continued to watch the ripples forming and dissolving across the crater's surface. "You're up early," Rowan's voice said softly behind him. "Hard to sleep," Emmett replied, his tone gentle. "Rain will do that," Rowan murmured, stepping beside him. The lieutenant's gaze drifted out across the reflective pools. "But it also gives us nights like this." Emmett nodded. Together they stood in silence, watching the craters whisper their quiet stories to the sky. Each ripple felt like a promise. Each reflection felt like a reminder. And somewhere deep within the soaked earth, it felt as though dawn was listening. The first true hint of dawn came not from the sky, but from the soft, drifting scent of something warm, something gentle and unexpected. Emmett lifted his head, inhaling slowly. The aroma carried faint notes of yeast, smoke, and a crisp, comforting warmth that cut through the dampness of the night. Bread, fresh, warm bread. No one knew exactly how the cooks managed it on mornings like this, when supplies were thin, the firewood damp, and everything seemed to struggle against the rain. But somehow, now and then, a small miracle appeared in the form of simple food. And on this quiet, rain-soaked morning, the smell rose through the trench like a blessing. As Emmett walked back toward the main dugout, the air seemed to grow warmer around him. Lantern flames flickered in small, hesitant motions as the draft shifted. The mist that had once clung thickly to the trench now began to thin, rising in wisps that glowed faintly with the earliest pale light creeping into the sky. He turned a corner and saw several soldiers gathered near a makeshift table, a pair of crates stacked beneath a waterproof sheet. Steam curled upward from a pot in which a round loaf rested, its crust golden, despite the meager fire that had baked it. Private Rourke, the closest thing they had to a cook, hovered protectively nearby, cutting small slices with a dull knife that he wiped on his sleeve between each cut. "Don't crowd," Rourke muttered, though his tone was soft and his eyes warm. "There's enough to share if you've got a bit of patience." The men waited, not with desperation, but with a gentle quiet, almost reverent. Bread was simple, ordinary, but here, in the cold, damp morning, after a night of rain and reflection, it felt extraordinary. Emmett stepped into the line, watching steam rise from each slice as Rourke handed them out. The warmth drifted through the air, softening the chill that clung to the soldiers' coats and settling around them like a fragile embrace. When it was his turn, Emmett accepted his slice with both hands. The bread was rough, slightly uneven, but warm, so warm it felt alive. He could feel the heat through his gloves, seeping into his palms. Taking a small bite, he closed his eyes. The taste was simple, mild, but profoundly comforting. It reminded him of early mornings at home when his mother would bake before the sun rose, filling the kitchen with the scent of rising dough and wood-fired ovens. For a moment he let the memory linger, wrapping around him like a blanket. Nearby, Morley sat on an overturned bucket, holding his slice close to his lips as though savoring its aroma before taking a bite. "Haven't had bread this good since. Can't even remember," he murmured. Lenton chuckled softly. "Might just be the rain, making it taste better." "Or the quiet," another soldier added. Emmett smiled faintly. They were all right. Everything tasted deeper, felt warmer, meant more, especially after nights like this when the world softened enough to let them breathe. Lieutenant Rowan approached, hands clasped behind his back. He took no bread himself, not yet, but nodded approvingly at the sight of his men gathered peacefully over their small portions. "Good to see you all warming up," he said quietly. "Eat slow. Let the morning come gently." His words fit perfectly with the moment. The men relaxed further, shoulders easing as they took unhurried bites. Above them, the rain had slowed to a fine drizzle, its droplets light enough to feel like a whisper on the skin. The sky began to shift from deep blue to a muted gray, then to a softer tone that hinted at dawn's approach, subtle but undeniable. As Emmett finished his bread, he sensed the world opening. The craters beyond the trench glimmered faintly with the coming light. The air vibrated with the soft hum of life stirring again. Even the mud, dark and heavy, seemed to shine with new texture under the shifting sky. Warmth lingered in his hands, his chest, and somewhere deep in his thoughts. Sometimes, he realized, peace came not in grand gestures, but in the offering of warm bread on a rainy morning, a reminder that even in the midst of hardship, the simplest comforts could help a person feel human again. He took a slow breath, letting the warmth fill him. A new day was beginning. Morning did not arrive all at once. It stretched itself slowly over the landscape, unfurling like a soft ribbon of light across the misty horizon. The rain had dwindled to a delicate drizzle, the droplets so fine that they hovered in the air like shimmering dust. The sky above the Somme shifted from muted gray to a faint pearlescent glow, the kind of early light that carried no sharp edges, only soothing softness. Emmett stood at the edge of the trench once more, watching as dawn eased its way into the world. The air tasted different now, lighter, cleaner, infused with a cool breath of morning. Each inhalation felt like a quiet renewal, washing away a layer of the heaviness from the night before. The puddles in the craters, once dark and opaque, now reflected the softening sky, shimmering with pale hints of pink and lavender. The earth around them glistened, every blade of stubborn grass tipped with droplets that caught the newborn light. Even the tangled barbed wire took on a strange beauty, its cruel edges softened by the rain and illuminated by dawn's gentle fingers. Behind Emmett, the trench stirred awake. A soldier stretched with a low groan, his joints stiff from the damp night. Another rubbed sleep from his eyes, blinking slowly as he adjusted to the new light. Murmured conversations drifted through the air, quiet, unhurried, touched with the warmth that comes from shared survival. Private Morley hummed again, this time a tune with more structure, something that rose and fell like the breath of the morning itself. Lenton joined in with a whistle, off-key but cheerful, the sound floating through the trench like a small bird testing its wings. The scent of warm bread still lingered faintly, mingling now with the earth's fresh morning exhale. Lanterns flickered less brightly as natural light grew, but none of the men moved to extinguish them just yet. There was comfort in their glow, in the way they bridged the shift from night to day. Lieutenant Rowan walked the trench path with measured steps, his boots leaving softer impressions now that the rain had eased. He stopped occasionally to exchange quiet words, checking on the men with a calm presence. When he reached Emmett, he paused beside him, hands resting lightly behind his back. "Fair morning," Rowan said, his voice carried gently by the thick air. Emmett nodded. "Feels peaceful." Rowan allowed a small smile. "The rain gave us that, I think. A rare gift." They stood in silence for a moment, listening to the soft footfalls behind them and the distant rustle of wind across the open fields. The lieutenant's gaze drifted toward the horizon, where a faint sliver of gold peeked through the thinning clouds. "Days like this," he murmured, "help us remember what we're enduring for." Emmett followed his gaze. The world, for all its scars, looked fragile and beautiful in the morning light. It was a reminder that even shattered landscapes could hold promise, that even weary souls could find meaning in the gentlest of dawns. A soft gust of wind stirred the mist, lifting it into graceful spirals that drifted upward before dissolving into the brightening sky. The trench boards creaked beneath someone's slow steps. A kettle somewhere began to rattle over a small flame, sending up curling wisps of steam that blended with the rising morning air. Emmett closed his eyes briefly, letting the warmth of the moment wash over him. For the first time in days, perhaps longer, he felt a quiet clarity settle inside him. The war had not changed. The uncertainty still lay beyond the trench walls. But this morning, this peaceful, rain-washed morning, felt like a reminder that hope could survive even the harshest storms, and that sometimes the strongest thing a person could do was simply breathe into the new day. He opened his eyes again, watching the sky brighten another shade. Morning had arrived not with a shout, but with a whisper, and that whisper felt like healing. The morning light continued to unfold gently, settling over the trench like a calm hand smoothing a rumpled blanket. Though the rain had eased into a thin mist, droplets still clung to every surface: helmets, wooden beams, canvas flaps, and the blades of grass that dared to grow through cracks in the earth. The world glimmered with soft sheen, as if the night had polished it with care. With daylight strengthening, the first tasks of the morning began, slowly, without urgency, guided by the lingering tranquility left by the rain. These early duties were simple, almost meditative, and for the men who performed them, they offered a sense of purpose that wasn't tangled in fear or noise. Emmett found himself assigned to a small maintenance group tending to the trench boards. Water pooled easily after a night of rain, and the boards, though sturdy, often shifted or warped. Carefully he stepped across the slick planks, his breath steady and even. Morley walked beside him, humming as usual, though his tune now carried the lightness of morning rather than the melancholy of night. They lifted a warped board together, sliding a dry plank underneath to reinforce it. The wood made a soft thunk as it settled into place, a satisfying sound that felt oddly grounding. Emmett brushed his hand over the new board's surface. It still carried the scent of fresh-cut timber, a clean, warm smell that contrasted with the damp earth around them. "This one'll hold a good while," Morley murmured with a small grin. "Let's hope," Emmett replied, the corner of his mouth lifting. Rows of sandbags, darkened by moisture, lined the trench walls like silent guardians. Some had slumped overnight, giving way under the weight of the wet soil. Corporal Lenton and another soldier were tying new burlap sacks, filling them with earth and patting them down before stacking them in careful layers. Their movements were rhythmic, patient, almost soothing. Rain had softened the ground just enough to make the work easier. From nearby came the faint clink of metal as someone polished a rifle, not with urgency but with steady, methodical strokes. The scent of gun oil mingled with the earthy air, creating a strangely nostalgic blend that reminded Emmett of early training days before the front had become his world. Farther down the trench, Lieutenant Rowan moved among the men, offering quiet instructions. His tone remained gentle, as though he didn't wish to disturb the lingering peace. Emmett admired that about him. Some officers carried authority like a heavy mantle. Rowan carried his like a lantern, calm, warm, guiding rather than demanding. Emmett and Morley shifted to the next section of boards, where puddles shimmered in shallow depressions. They scooped away excess water with small tins, letting it trickle into the narrow drainage channel that ran alongside the trench. The water's movement made a soft gurgling sound, almost musical as it flowed. Above them, the sky continued to brighten, revealing soft bands of pale gold stretching through the thinning clouds. A gentle breeze drifted across the trench, lifting strands of mist from the ground and carrying them away in slow, swirling motions. It brushed across Emmett's face, cool and refreshing, as though morning itself was offering a quiet greeting. He paused for a moment, resting his hands on his knees, simply taking in the scene around him. The soldiers worked with easy companionship, talking in low voices or simply sharing the silence. Every sound felt softened by the lingering rain, the tap of a hammer, the scrape of a shovel, the quiet rustle of coats brushing against wood. Nothing about the morning felt rushed. Nothing felt heavy. Even the war for this brief stretch of time felt distant, like a storm waiting beyond the horizon, rather than a shadow standing at their doorstep. Morley nudged Emmett lightly with his elbow. "Feels good to do something with steady ground under our feet." Emmett nodded. "It feels good to have a morning like this at all." As they finished the last of their tasks, the sky opened a little more, revealing a pale patch of blue. The kind of blue that only appears after long rains, washed clean and delicate as silk. Emmett straightened, stretching his back, feeling the gentle pull of muscles warmed by work, rather than tension. He let out a slow breath, watching it drift into the cool air. The trench felt different now, tidier, sturdier, touched with the quiet pride of small accomplishments. Sometimes, he thought, healing didn't come in grand moments. Sometimes it came in lifting a board, tightening a rope, sharing a morning task with a friend, small things that steadied the world, one quiet effort at a time. With the morning's quiet tasks completed, the trench settled into a peaceful lull. The mist had thinned to faint ribbons drifting lazily through the air, and a soft breeze carried the scent of wet grass from somewhere beyond the earthen walls. The sky now held a gentle brightness, diffused, muted, as though daylight was being careful not to intrude too suddenly. As the soldiers rested, small groups formed naturally along the trench, men sitting on crates, leaning against sandbags, or crouching with arms draped over their knees. There was no urgency to their movements. Their faces, still softened by the night's calm, seemed lit from within by an air of quiet reflection. Emmett found a place beneath a slightly drooping canvas sheet, its edges still dripping from the earlier rainfall. Morley joined him, settling cross-legged on the boards with a contented sigh. A moment later, Lenton wandered over, wiping his hands on his coat and lowering himself to sit beside them. For a time, they simply listened to the trench's gentle soundtrack. A kettle hissing softly over a flame, the low murmur of voices, the rhythmic drip of water falling from the last stubborn droplets clinging to the canvas above. Then, almost shyly, as though testing the air, Morley broke the silence. "You know," he began, picking at a loose thread on his sleeve, "this morning reminds me of the river back home. After a storm, everything smelled like the world had been washed clean. My brothers and I used to skip stones until our arms ached." Lenton chuckled quietly. "I bet you never hit the far bank, did you?" Morley grinned. "Not once. But I pretended I could." The three men shared a soft laugh, the kind that didn't rise loud, but warmed the space between them like a gentle ember. Emmett leaned back against the sandbags, letting the laughter settle. He thought of his sister's letter, of the field she described turning green again. The memory of her handwriting, her soft looping letters, made something tender stir in his chest. "I used to race my sister to the top of the hill behind our house whenever it rained," Emmett said quietly. "She always beat me, always. Even when she slipped and skinned her knee, she'd still hop up and take off running." Morley smiled. "Sounds like she had your spirit." "Or I had hers," Emmett replied. For a while the three men talked in soft tones, sharing small memories, nothing grand or dramatic, just pieces of their lives, favorite corners of towns they missed, the smell of certain foods, the names of streets where they learned to ride bicycles, the way their windows rattled in winter storms. These were stories with no sharp edges, gentle recollections smoothed by time and distance. The kind of stories that asked for nothing, demanded nothing, and yet gave so much. Across the trench, other groups were doing the same. One man recounted how he once tried to make his own canoe and sank it within minutes. Another described a bakery near his home, where the baker always pretended to scold customers but slipped pastries into their pockets when they left. Quiet laughter floated through the air like soft wind chimes stirred by a passing breeze. Lieutenant Rowan passed by from time to time, pausing briefly to listen, offering a faint smile before moving on. Even he seemed touched by the ease that had settled across his men. This was not the roaring camaraderie of taverns or celebrations. It was something gentler, an intimacy forged not from noise, but from presence. a reminder that behind their uniforms, behind their fear and fatigue, they were still sons, brothers, friends, still human. As Emmett listened, he felt himself sinking deeper into the moment. The trench, so often a place defined by tension, now felt like a sheltered room carved from rain and morning light. The men were bound together not by orders or necessity, but by the threads of memory weaving softly through the air. A soft breeze stirred once more, lifting the edges of the canvas above them. Tiny droplets fell, tapping gently against Emmett's sleeve. He brushed them away and smiled faintly. Stories, quiet, honest, shared without expectation, had a way of making the world feel whole again. And for the first time in a long while, he felt that wholeness wrap around them, steady and warm, like a blanket drawn over tired shoulders. As the morning continued to brighten, the trench slowly transitioned from its restful hush into the gentle rhythm of routine. But even with tasks picking up and quiet conversations lingering like echoes of the earlier calm, a certain stillness remained in the air, a watchfulness shaped not by fear, but by awareness, a kind of reverent pause between breaths. Emmett was assigned to a short watch shift along the forward edge of the trench. It wasn't a demanding task on this peaceful morning. Rather, it was more like standing at the threshold of two worlds, the safety of the trench behind him and the quiet, glistening expanse of no man's land before him. He climbed the narrow wooden steps leading up to the lookout nook, the boards damp beneath his boots. When he reached the top, he rested his elbows gently against the sandbags stacked along the parapet. The height gave him a clearer view of the landscape stretching outward, soft as watercolor under the new day's light. The fields were silvered with dew and rain, each drop catching the early sun like tiny sparks along the wrinkled earth. Pools of water still rested in the craters, smooth as glass, and reflecting the sky with a calm sincerity that belied the scars that had formed them. Mist rose from the ground in slow, twisting strands, dancing in the mild breeze before dissolving into the warming air. There was no movement across the field, no sound of distant fire, no sudden shouts, only the steady heartbeat of the world waking gently. Emmett let out a slow breath, feeling his lungs expand in a way they seldom did during daylight. He had almost forgotten what it meant to stand in quiet watchfulness without tension tightening every muscle. Below him, the trench bustled in soft, purposeful ways. Soldiers moved with unhurried steps, carrying tools, adjusting sandbags, tending to small duties that had waited through the night. The earlier conversations had faded into murmurs of practical focus, though every now and then a laugh drifted upward, light and unforced. Lieutenant Rowan stood farther down the line, speaking quietly with a pair of privates. His posture was relaxed, his voice calm. He glanced occasionally toward the horizon, as if making sure the peace the morning had granted them still held firm. Emmett's gaze shifted back to no man's land. There was something mesmerizing about the way the light spread across the landscape, not boldly, but with a shy glow, as though it too respected the solemn history of the countless days and nights that had unfolded here. A small bird flitted across the open field, landing on a piece of twisted wire. It shook its feathers, droplets scattering in a delicate arc, then hopped along the wire as though testing its stability. Emmett watched it for a long moment, marveling at how such fragile life could move so freely in a place shaped by so much destruction. Perhaps, he thought, the land was beginning to breathe again. He scanned the horizon methodically, not out of worry, but because vigilance remained part of his duty. The quiet didn't erase the reality of where they were, but it softened it, transformed it, even if only briefly, into something that felt almost sacred, like the land itself was offering a moment of truce. A faint rustle behind him signaled Morley climbing the steps to join him. "Peaceful up here," Morley whispered, resting his chin on the sandbag as he looked out. "Feels like the world's holding still," Emmett replied. Morley nodded. "Haven't seen it this calm in months." They stood side by side, sharing the silence, watching the morning unfold. It felt good to have another presence beside him, someone who understood without needing to speak. After a moment, Morley exhaled slowly. "Makes you believe the land remembers what it was before all this." Emmett smiled faintly. "Maybe it's trying to remember." They lingered another minute, savoring the stillness that embraced them. The air was cool against their skin, but not uncomfortable, the kind of cool that woke the senses gently. Emmett found himself closing his eyes for a brief second, letting the warmth of the rising sun brush across his face. When he opened them again, the field still lay calm, the mist thinning into delicate threads that curled upward like prayers. This was watchfulness, yes, but it was also peace, a quiet moment in which the world seemed to pause, acknowledging the weary souls who stood guard in hope rather than fear. The peaceful morning continued to stretch gently across the trench, its calm settling into even the smallest corners. As Emmett descended the lookout steps and returned to the main walkway, he noticed a familiar figure approaching from the far end, a medic, coat slightly darker from lingering moisture, a canvas satchel slung over his shoulder. Medic Harris was a quiet man, known for his steady hands and soft-spoken presence. He moved with unhurried purpose, stopping every few yards to check on someone, whether they needed assistance or not. His arrival always brought a subtle sense of comfort, like the soft glow of a lantern carried into a room that had grown dim. Emmett stepped aside to let him pass, but Harris paused, offering a gentle nod. "Morning, Harrow," he greeted. His voice was calm, its tone warm enough to soften the cool air around them. "Mind if I have a look at that scrape on your temple? Took a bit of a knock yesterday." Emmett had almost forgotten. The scrape had stung briefly when he washed his face with cold water before dawn, but it hadn't felt like much. Still, he lifted his helmet with a small smile. "Sure? Didn't realize it was worth checking." Harris's lips curved slightly. "They all are. Small things stay small only with a bit of attention." He reached into his satchel and withdrew a folded cloth and a small tin of ointment. The scent of antiseptic, sharp but clean, mingled with the more earthy fragrances of the trench. Harris dabbed the cloth gently against the scrape, his movements so cautious that Emmett barely felt the touch. He worked with a quiet focus, as though each action was an act of care rather than duty. "There?" Harris murmured. "Nothing to worry about, but keep it clean. Rainwater's not as harmless as it looks." Emmett nodded gratefully. "Thanks." Harris resumed walking, stopping next to Morley, who was seated on a crate adjusting his boot. "How's the ankle today?" the medic asked. Morley shrugged, lifting his booted foot slightly. "Better, I think. Just stiff." Harris knelt, inspecting it with gentle fingers. "Stiff is fine. Pain? Only when I twist it. Well, try not to twist it," Harris said with a soft chuckle. He wrapped the ankle with fresh bandage and patted Morley's leg before rising. "You're doing well." As he moved along the trench, soldiers greeted him with nods, smiles, or grateful murmurs. Harris checked wrists for sprains, cleaned small cuts, distributed a few tablets for headaches, and offered warm water to those who needed it. For each man, he gave a moment of undivided attention, something rare and precious here. Lieutenant Rowan approached from the opposite direction, his expression thoughtful as he watched Harris work. When they met in the middle, the two exchanged a quiet conversation. Rowan's voice lowered in respect, and Harris nodded at intervals, reassuring him with calm gestures. "Any serious concerns?" Rowan asked softly. "Nothing beyond the usual," Harris replied. "A few aches, a few scratches. Spirits seem better this morning." Rowan glanced down the trench where men were moving with visible ease, smiles soft but present. "The rain did them good," Harris agreed. "Rain has a way of washing the mind as much as the earth." The lieutenant offered a rare, appreciative smile. "Thank you, Harris. You keep them steady." "Just doing my part," Harris answered gently, before continuing his rounds. Emmett watched him go, feeling a quiet admiration well in his chest. In a place shaped by strain and uncertainty, people like Harris became anchors, steady, compassionate, quietly heroic. They reminded the men that care still existed, even here, that kindness could flourish in the smallest acts, a bandage wrapped with steady hands, a reassuring word spoken into a tired morning, a moment of presence shared between weary souls. Emmett touched the now clean scrape on his temple and felt a surprising warmth in the simple gesture. It wasn't the injury that mattered. It was the reminder that he wasn't invisible, that someone saw him, not just as a soldier, but as a person worth tending to. The clouds above shifted, revealing another patch of pale blue. A soft breeze brushed past, carrying the freshly turned scent of earth and the faint sweetness of morning dew. Some days, Emmett realized, healing didn't happen all at once. Sometimes it came in small visits, carried by steady hands, wrapped in quiet kindness, over and over again. As the morning grew stronger, the light warmed the mist until it shimmered like a fine veil drifting across the trench. The air was calmer now, touched by a faint golden hue that softened even the harshest outlines of the earthworks. Birds had begun to stir along the distant hedgerows, their small calls rising delicately above the quiet murmur of men returning to their routine. Emmett found himself walking toward the far end of the trench, where a narrow opening allowed a glimpse of a lonely hill in the distance. It wasn't much, just a slope dotted with a few stubborn trees, but it stood taller than the rest of the land, giving it the appearance of a gentle, watchful sentinel overlooking the scarred fields. As he stepped into the open nook, he paused. A faint sound drifted through the cool morning air, not the clink of tools, not the rustle of canvas, not the dampened echo of distant artillery. This sound was softer, floating like a memory carried on a breeze. Bells. Emmett straightened slightly, listening with all his breath. The tone was delicate, so faint it almost dissolved into the air before reaching him. Yet it was unmistakable, a distant peal of church bells, ringing somewhere beyond the front, beyond the trenches, beyond the tangled web of wire and mud. The sound felt impossible. And yet, there it was. He closed his eyes to listen more clearly. The bells chimed in slow, measured intervals, each note rising gently over the land as if carried by invisible hands. They were too far away for the melody to be clear, but not so distant that their meaning could be lost. They spoke of mornings untouched by war, of towns waking with the smell of bread and hearth smoke, of doors opening, of footsteps crossing quiet streets. of someone sweeping dust from a stoop while listening to the familiar toll. They spoke of home. A soft shiver passed through Emmett, not of cold, but of longing eased rather than sharpened. Somehow the bells didn't hurt, they healed. They felt like threads of sound stitching a thin seam between the life he once lived and the life he now survived. Morley approached from behind, his footsteps slow and curious. "You hear that too?" he whispered. Emmett nodded. Morley stepped beside him, leaning slightly over the sandbags. "Haven't heard bells since I can't even remember. Thought maybe I was dreaming." "It's real," Emmett murmured. "Faint, but real." Lenton soon joined them, brow furrowed in gentle wonder. "Wind's carrying it," he said softly. "Has to be from one of the towns behind the lines. Maybe they're ringing for morning service." Emmett listened again. The bells continued, steady, patient, as though they had waited through 1,000 nights to be heard by tired ears. The sound rippled across the land, touching crater water, rusted metal, broken posts, and the fragile blades of grass growing defiantly through the mud. Even the birds paused their calls, as if listening too. Lieutenant Rowan approached quietly, drawn by the gathered men. When he heard the faint chiming, his expression softened. He did not speak at first. He simply stood there, letting the sound settle into him, into all of them. At last he said, very quietly, "There were mornings when I'd hear bells like that at home. My mother used to say they were reminders that no matter how troubled the world became, somewhere someone was praying for peace." The men fell silent again. A few soldiers farther down the trench looked up, searching the mist as if trying to catch the direction of the sound. Faces softened, shoulders eased. Something like warmth spread across the line. Not the heat of the sun, but the warmth of memory gently rekindled. The bells chimed again, and in that moment the entire trench felt as though it had paused its heartbeat, not in fear, but in reverence. The sound of bells reaching them across the wounded land was a rare miracle, a delicate bridge between past and present, a whisper of a world still intact, waiting patiently for its sons to return. Emmett opened his eyes and looked toward the horizon, a small, steady smile forming. The bells faded slowly, carried away by the shifting wind. But their echo, soft, hopeful, enduring, remained. As the bells faded into the warmth of the morning air, the men slowly drifted back to their quiet routines. But something about the sound lingered, like a soft resonance in the heart, a gentle reminder that the world beyond the trenches still existed. The light had grown brighter now, brushing the edges of the trench with gold, revealing textures and shapes softened by the night's rain. Emmett walked along the duckboards, the wood now drying in long streaks beneath the strengthening daylight. His boots made a gentle, familiar creak with every step. The air moved with a refreshing coolness, carrying the faint scent of damp grass and warmed earth. As he approached the far bend, where the trench curved toward a collapsed section, something caught his eye, a small glint of metal half embedded in the mud. It wasn't the sharp glint of a shell fragment or a twisted piece of wire. This was rounder, softer in appearance, and almost inviting in its glow. Emmett crouched, brushing aside a thin layer of wet soil. His fingers closed around a small tarnished object, a pocket watch. Its silver casing was dented, but intact, engraved with delicate swirls that time and rain had not entirely erased. A thin chain, broken at one end, trailed behind it like a tired ribbon. He turned the watch over in his hand, wiping away the mud with his thumb. The glass face had cracked slightly, but the hands were still visible, frozen in place at a time long past. Emmett felt a quiet ache stir in his chest. Someone had carried this. Someone had wound it carefully each morning. Someone had listened to its ticking in the calm moments before sleep. A life lived around its small, steady rhythm. Morley approached from behind, noticing Emmett's posture. "Find something?" he asked gently. Emmett nodded and held up the watch for him to see. Morley's eyes softened. Beautiful piece. Someone must have dropped it before a shift, maybe weeks ago. Or longer, Emmett murmured. He felt the faint weight of the watch settle into his palm, warm now from his touch. He pressed the small button at the top. The clasp clicked softly as the cover opened, revealing the interior. The hands were still, but the tiny inner gears glinted faintly. On the underside of the lid he noticed something else, a faint inscription, etched in delicate cursive. "To my dearest Thomas, may time bring you home again." Emmett read the words twice, then closed the lid gently, as though afraid roughness might break something sacred. Morley exhaled slowly. Whoever Thomas was, he must have treasured that. Emmett nodded, feeling a quiet heaviness mingled with tenderness. The earth carried so many stories, stories half buried, waiting for someone to find them, to hold them for a moment, and remember. Lieutenant Rowan arrived a few minutes later, drawn by the subtle gathering at the bend. "What have we here?" he asked softly. Emmett handed him the watch, explaining where he found it. Rowan held the object with careful fingers, his expression thoughtful. "We'll keep it in the personal effects box," he said. "If we can't find who it belonged to now, perhaps someday, someone will claim it." He tapped the cover lightly with his thumb, then gave it back to Emmett. "Until then, keep it safe. No sense letting it lie in the mud again." Emmett accepted it with a nod. As Rowan moved away, Emmett sat for a moment on a nearby crate, cradling the watch in his hands. Though silent, though broken, it hummed in its own way, through memory, through weight, through the story etched into its lid. He imagined Thomas. Perhaps he laughed loudly. Perhaps he whispered his hopes to this very watch. Perhaps he thought of someone waiting for him each time he wound it. The object felt like a bridge, one that connected Emmett not only to an unnamed soldier, but to every small tenderness carried into war. He tucked the watch gently into his coat pocket, feeling it rest against the letter from his sister. Two small pieces of different lives, carried together in the same space over his heart. The morning breeze stirred again, rustling the edges of the trench walls and lifting the faint scent of wild clover. Emmett took a long, steady breath. Some gifts were not chosen. Some were found quietly, unexpectedly, and held with reverence. This watch, this small fragment of another man's world, felt like one of those gifts. The morning had fully claimed the sky now, though its light remained gentle, softened by drifting wisps of leftover mist. The trench, once shadowed and cool, now glowed with a washed brightness that highlighted the texture of every surface, the weathered boards, the coarse burlap of the sandbags, the scattered bits of metal and earth. It felt as though the world had been quietly brushed with a painter's hand, while the men worked and watched and breathed. Emmett walked along the narrow corridor toward a section of the trench rarely visited except during patrol shifts. It was quieter there, more secluded, shielded by a tall bank of earth that curved protectively over the wooden planks. He wasn't on duty now, just taking a brief moment to stretch his legs, to let the fresh air settle deeper into his lungs. As he rounded the bend, he paused. Just beyond the trench wall, in a small pocket of earth, sheltered from the harsh winds and heavy foot traffic, something unexpected had found a way to bloom. Wildflowers. Not many, just a small cluster. But their presence was like a whisper of another world. Their delicate petals glistened with leftover raindrops, catching the light that filtered gently through the thinning mist. Pale purple blossoms swayed lightly in the breeze. Tiny stars clustered among the coarse grasses and churned soil. Emmett approached slowly, almost reverently. The flowers seemed impossibly fragile in such a place. Yet here they stood, bold in their softness, defiant in their beauty. Morley, wandering nearby, noticed Emmett's stillness and followed his gaze. His breath caught softly. "Well now," Morley murmured, "would you look at that? Didn't think anything this pretty could grow out here?" Emmett crouched beside the small patch, careful not to disturb the blossoms. The petals smelled faintly sweet, almost like lavender, though lighter, more subtle. He touched one gently with the back of his finger, marveling at how cool and smooth it felt. "It's a wonder they survived the rain," he said. "It's a wonder they sprouted at all," Morley replied. "This soil's seen too much." But the flowers didn't seem to mind. Their stems were slender but strong, rooted deeply in the earth as though they had claimed this tiny sanctuary as their own. Emmett couldn't help but think of the pocket watch resting in his coat, another small token of a life beyond the trenches. And now, these wildflowers, blooming quietly in the margins of destruction. They felt like threads of grace woven into the fabric of the morning. A few other soldiers noticed the cluster as they passed, offering soft smiles or murmured words of wonder. No one dared to pluck a single blossom. It was as though they collectively understood that the flowers offered something far more important than a keepsake. They offered a moment of quiet healing. Lieutenant Rowan approached after hearing the murmurs of discovery. He stepped closer, hands clasped behind his back, eyes softening at the sight. "Well," he said with a gentle nod, "seems nature hasn't given up on us yet." One of the younger soldiers, Private Amos, lingered at the back of the group. He cleared his throat shyly. "My mum used to say wildflowers grow where the earth remembers joy," he said, looking down at his boots, "even if we don't." A hush settled over the group at those words, soft, tender, reflective. Rowan placed a hand on Amos's shoulder. "Then perhaps the earth is remembering something for us this morning." Amos gave a faint smile and nodded, his eyes lingering on the blossoms. Emmett found himself sitting on the narrow ledge of the trench, simply watching the flowers sway in the breeze. The sight invited him to breathe a little deeper, to let tension slip from his chest. It was impossible to ignore the contrast, the beauty against the brokenness, the softness amid the scars. And yet it was precisely that contrast that made the moment feel so precious. He thought of home again, of fields that bloomed with wild flowers each spring, bright splashes of color against rolling hills. He imagined walking barefoot through those fields, the tickle of grass against his ankles, the hum of insects dancing through the warm air. For the first time in a long while, the memory didn't ache. It felt like a balm. Morley nudged Emmett lightly. "Seems the world's trying to remind us what it used to look like." "Or what it could look like again," Emmett added softly. A breeze brushed past them, lifting the petals gently, stirring their scent into the morning. The flowers swayed, resilient and radiant, small but unyielding in their quiet defiance. And Emmett felt something inside him strengthen, something rooted, delicate, but alive, a hope that, like these wildflowers, could bloom even in the most unlikely places. The gentle brightness of the late morning settled warmly over the trench, smoothing the edges of the churned earth and lending a comforting glow to the routine unfolding within its narrow walls. The earlier mist had thinned into faint wisps that clung playfully to the air, drifting like the last remnants of a dream someone wasn't quite ready to leave behind. As Emmett made his way back toward the central dugout, a new scent welcomed him, richer than the simple aroma of bread from earlier, and warm enough to stir a subtle hunger in every soldier who caught its path. Breakfast. A pot of porridge had been coaxed into life over a low flame, thick and creamy despite the limited rations. Its steam rose in slow curls, carrying the earthy scent of oats softened by heat and stirred with whatever bits the cook could spare. A pinch of salt, a scrap of dried fruit, maybe even a splash of condensed milk from a precious tin. The aroma drifted through the trench, settling around the men like a gentle invitation to pause and gather. Private Rourke, sleeves rolled above his elbows, stood hunched over the pot with a wooden spoon nearly as long as his arm. He stirred with deliberate, soothing movements as though coaxing warmth directly into the hearts of the men around him. His face was flushed from the heat of the fire, but the soft morning light softened him too, casting a warm halo through the steam. "Step up, lads," he murmured, not raising his voice. "Still hot? Still plenty." A slow line formed, not out of desperation, but out of quiet gratitude. Porridge was simple fare, but on a morning like this, after rain, after shared stories, after soft bells and fragile flowers, its warmth felt like something sacred. Emmett accepted a battered tin cup filled nearly to the brim. The steam curled against his face, carrying the comforting scent straight into his chest. He wrapped both hands around the cup, letting the warmth seep into his fingers. Even the metal felt alive with heat. Morley and Lenton joined him, each cradling their own cup. They found a spot along a smooth section of trench wall and sat with quiet contentment. The boards beneath them had dried just enough to feel warm under the rising sun. Emmett took his first spoonful slowly. The porridge was thick, almost velvety on his tongue, with a hint of sweetness that surprised him. One tiny sliver of dried apple floated near the surface, an unexpected treasure. He smiled softly as he chewed, feeling the warmth travel deeper into his chest. Across the trench, other men hunched over their portions, steam rising from each cup like dozens of small, glowing chimneys. Conversations sparked here and there, gentle remarks about the taste, murmurs of appreciation for Rourke's skill, a few quiet jokes to lighten the mood. "Never thought porridge could taste this good," Morley said after a moment, sighing as he leaned back. "Almost feels like home." Lenton nodded, blowing gently on his next spoonful. "It's the warmth that does it. After a night like last night, your bones crave something steady." Emmett watched the steam coil from his cup. It shimmered as the light touched it, like morning ghosts rising from a sleeping world. He breathed it in, letting it mingle with the memory of the wildflowers, the faint echo of bells, the quiet comfort of being tended by the medic's steady hands. Everything about this morning felt softened, gentle, held together by threads of simple humanity. Lieutenant Rowan approached quietly, accepting his own cup from Rourke with a nod of thanks. He didn't join the men in their casual clusters, but stood nearby, leaning lightly against a post as he ate with slow, thoughtful movements. His presence made the trench feel even more grounded, like a tall, steady tree standing at the center of a quiet grove. Emmett watched him for a moment, then let his eyes drift upward. The sky had brightened into a pale, delicate blue that seemed almost fragile, as though one loud sound could crack it. Sunlight brushed across the top of the trench, warming the damp edges and drawing thin trails of steam from the earth. For a moment, no one spoke. The only sounds were the soft scrape of spoons against tin, the rustle of uniforms shifting in comfortable positions, and the low simmer of the porridge pot settling as the fire crackled quietly beneath it. It felt less like a war front and more like a small village waking together after a long, healing rainstorm. Emmett finished his last spoonful and held the cup close to his chest, savoring the final warmth before it faded. Sometimes, he thought, comfort didn't require abundance. Sometimes it was a warm cup, a quiet morning, a shared silence, a reminder that even in the hardest places, there could still be gentleness. When breakfast finally dwindled into warm echoes and empty cups, the trench shifted gently into its next quiet rhythm. Some men resumed their small tasks, others tidied their corners of the dugout, and a few lingered with sleepy contentment, reluctant to let go of the morning's softness. The air felt lighter still, washed clean by the rain, and warmed now by the calm ascent of the sun. Near the command shelter, Lieutenant Rowan stepped inside a narrow wooden enclosure built from rough planks and reinforced with sheets of tin. Emmett, finishing his cup and rinsing it with a splash of clean water, noticed the officer's subtle gesture that invited him to follow. Inside the shelter, the air was cool and dim, lit by a single lantern hanging from a wire overhead. Its glow fell softly over a table spread with maps, layers of paper weighted down by smooth stones and metal clips to keep the corners from curling. The lantern light warmed the lines of ink, making the trenches and ridges and faint marks of elevation appear almost like the veins of some ancient leaf. Rowan stood with his hands braced lightly against the table, studying the map with an expression that held neither urgency nor worry, only quiet reflection. Emmett waited respectfully near the entrance until Rowan turned. "Thought you might appreciate a look," the lieutenant said gently. "Days like this, it helps to understand the land we're living on." Emmett stepped closer. The maps were beautifully detailed in their own stark way, the sweeping curves of hills, the broken lines of trenches, the small dotted paths that stretched between sectors. He traced a finger through the air above them, not touching the paper but following the gentle contours. "It looks calmer on the map," Emmett murmured. Rowan nodded. "Maps tell the truth, but only a peaceful truth. They don't show the noise or the fear." He tapped a small symbol near a bend in the trench, "but they do show shape, space, direction." The lantern flickered softly, casting shifting patterns across the surface. Emmett's eyes followed the familiar lines, places he'd walked, stood, crouched, breathed through. But on the map they appeared almost serene, like quiet pathways drawn by an artist's hand. Rowan reached for a pencil, tracing a light line along the ridge where the sun had risen earlier. "This ridge shelters us from the worst of the winds," he explained quietly. "On clear days you can see the church steeple in the far village." He paused. "I'd wager those bells we heard came from there." Emmett smiled faintly. "Makes sense." The lieutenant shifted his gaze to Emmett. "You did well on watch this morning. Calm eyes see farther than anxious ones." A warm flush rose in Emmett's chest, not pride exactly, but something gentler. "Thank you, sir. It felt peaceful up there for once." Rowan exhaled softly, a breath that carried a hint of relief. "We take these mornings as they come. They're rare, precious." For a moment they both stood silently over the map, listening to the soft ambience of the trench outside, the distant clatter of a ladle being rinsed, the quiet laughter of two soldiers mending a torn coat, the steady rustle of wind threading through the canvas flaps. Rowan lifted one of the smooth stones anchoring the map and let it rest in his palm. It was round, river-worn, a soft gray mottled with pale lines. "Found this months ago, near a stream bed before the front shifted," he said. "I keep it here to remind me that even in a place like this, the world we knew before still exists somewhere." Emmett nodded, understanding more deeply than he expected. He reached for the pocket watch in his coat, feeling its familiar weight. "I suppose we all need reminders," he said softly. Rowan's gaze fell to Emmett's pocket with quiet recognition. "And sometimes the reminders find us." The lantern flickered again, sending a warm glow across Rowan's features. For a moment, the lieutenant didn't look like an officer weighed by responsibility. He looked like a man who appreciated the mixture of fragility and resilience that morning had revealed. Emmett leaned over the table once more, studying the graceful lines on the map. The shapes looked less like battle plans and more like a story being written slowly by the land itself, one that had chapters of hardship, yes, but also pages that held quiet beauty and gentleness. Outside, a breeze drifted through, lifting the canvas flap and letting in a stream of soft golden light. It washed over the table, mingling with the lantern's glow, illuminating the map with a warm, peaceful clarity. "It's strange," Emmett whispered, almost to himself, "how the land can feel wounded and beautiful at the same time." Rowan nodded slowly. "Strange, yes, but perhaps that's how we endure, by remembering that both truths can exist together." They stood there in shared stillness, two figures framed by morning light and soft shadows, contemplating a world that held terror and tenderness in equal measure. And for a moment, the map before them became not a guide to survival, but a quiet testament to the hope that still lived, quietly, gently, within the folds of the earth. After leaving the map table, Emmett stepped back into the open trench, the brightness of the late morning greeting him like a gentle hand upon his shoulder. The sky had begun to shift from soft gold to a pale, accepting blue, still muted, still delicate, but undeniably clearer. The lingering mist drifted upward in fading veils, dissolving piece by piece into the warming air. He walked slowly, savoring the feeling of the world stretching into itself after the long, rain-soaked night. The voices of the men were calm, low, almost melodic as they continued their quiet tasks. It felt as though the trench was a living organism, breathing in time with the morning, letting each moment unfold without strain. Then a breeze came, cool, wandering, unhurried. It swept through the trench with the feather-light touch of something curious, brushing across Emmett's sleeves, lifting a few strands of his hair, then winding lazily around the sandbags before drifting onward. As it passed, it seemed to gather scents from all around: damp wood, warm porridge, the subtle sweetness of blooming wild flowers, and the faint metallic tang of the earth. But it carried something else, too, a sound, soft, thin, almost indistinguishable from the murmuring air. Emmett paused, brow furrowing slightly. He turned his head, listening more intently. The breeze flowed again, and this time he caught it more clearly. A voice, not close, not sharp, more like an echo carried from far across the open fields, like the residue of a conversation spoken to the morning itself. The tone was low, warm, and indistinct, as though shaped by memory rather than distance. He held his breath, listening. The wind brushed past again, gentler this time, curling around the corner of the trench where Morley was sorting tools. Morley paused as well, his fingers stilling mid-motion. "You hear that?" he whispered. Emmett nodded, eyes scanning the open ridge beyond the trench. Sounds like, he hesitated, searching for the right word, like someone speaking, but not to us. Lenton approached from the next section, drawn by the same perplexity. Thought my ears were playing tricks, he admitted. Wind's carrying something strange today. The three men stood quietly, listening. Again the breeze came. Again the faint sound rose with it. This time, the voice, if it was a voice, seemed tinged with emotion. Gentle, rising and falling as though shaped by distant laughter or soft song. Not a language they could decipher, not a message meant for them. Just human, warm, alive. Lieutenant Rowan, hearing the murmurs, joined them. His boots made no more noise than the shifting of leaves as he approached. "What is it?" he asked softly. Emmett gestured toward the ridge. "There's something in the wind, sir. A voice of some kind." Rowan turned his head, listening with the calm, practiced focus of a man used to reading the land in subtle ways. When the breeze came again, he closed his eyes. For a moment, the world stood utterly still. When he opened them, his expression had softened, just slightly, but unmistakably. "It's not a voice," Rowan said. "Not exactly." He looked toward the horizon, his gaze steady and thoughtful. "That's the sound of a village waking. The hills carry it well on mornings like this." Emmett felt a quiet thrill of recognition. Now that Rowan had said it, the truth of it revealed itself. It wasn't one voice, but many, blended together into a hum of distant life. Pots clattering, women calling to children, doors creaking open, a dog barking with lazy insistence. Everything softened by distance into a single, warm current of sound. A message carried by the wind. Not meant for them, but not closed to them either. Morley let out a long breath. "Can't remember the last time I heard something so normal." Lenton nodded, a wistful smile touching his lips. "Feels like hearing the world breathe again." For several moments they all simply listened. The breeze ebbed and flowed, carrying with it fragments of daily life from beyond the front, mundane, beautiful, precious in their simplicity. The sounds felt like a gentle promise, a reminder that somewhere ordinary life continued, unchanged by the nightmare carved into the soil of the Somme. Rowan spoke quietly. "These mornings are rare, but when they come, they remind us what awaits beyond all this." Emmett closed his eyes, letting the wind wash across his face. The distant voices, shaped and softened by miles of air and earth, felt like a balm to the spirit. They hinted at hearths still burning, breakfasts being prepared, streets where children tugged at sleeves and asked questions that had nothing to do with uniforms or trenches. For a few precious breaths, Emmett let himself imagine that world, not as something lost, but as something waiting, patiently, tenderly, for those who would someday return to it. When he opened his eyes, the breeze had shifted again, carrying only silence now, but the echo remained, a gentle reminder woven into the morning, a whisper of life continuing beyond the war, a message carried by the wind. As the distant sounds carried by the wind faded softly back into quiet, the trench seemed to settle once more into its peaceful rhythm. The sun, still low in the sky but growing steadier with each passing minute, cast gentle rays across the boards. Light danced on lingering droplets, turning them into tiny sparks that shimmered whenever the breeze stirred. Emmett walked a little farther along the trench, feeling strangely lighter, as though the soft hum of life from beyond the front had smoothed something inside him. The men moved calmly around him, some cleaning their rifles, others folding blankets, a few simply sitting with eyes half closed, letting the morning settle into their bones. Then, from somewhere near the supply alcove, a familiar sound drifted through the air, a harmonica. Its notes rose slowly, tentatively at first, as though the musician were testing the courage of the morning. The melody began with a low, gentle hum, soft enough to blend with the lingering hush of the breeze. But gradually the sound deepened, warm and expressive, weaving through the trench like a ribbon of light. Emmett paused and let the music reach him. The tune was one he recognized, a lullaby, often heard in small town squares during festivals, played by wandering musicians with soft eyes and weathered hands. It was a melody carried by memory, a tune that grew tender in rain and firelight alike. Hearing it here, in the quiet aftermath of a long, soothing night, made something inside him unclench. Private Amos sat on a crate, harmonica lifted to his lips, eyes half-lidded in concentration. His fingers moved instinctively, pressing and releasing in a slow rhythm that matched the calm unfolding around them. The melody drifted upward, curling around the edges of the trench walls, rising toward the pale blue sky like a prayer set free. Morley approached and leaned against a post, listening with his arms loosely crossed. "Didn't know Amos could play like that," he whispered with a smile. Lenton joined them, tilting his head like a curious bird. "He doesn't play often, says he only plays when the morning feels right." He paused. "Guess the morning felt right today?" Emmett watched Amos closely. The young soldier swayed slightly with the rhythm, the harmonica gleaming faintly in the soft light. His breath moved through the instrument in slow waves, shaping each note with care. There was nothing showy about the music. It wasn't meant to impress. It was meant to soothe, to reach tired hearts in the simplest, gentlest way. The melody expanded, blooming into a fuller phrase that wrapped itself around the men nearby. Conversations quieted out of respect. Footsteps slowed. Even the clatter of tools softened as soldiers instinctively allowed the music to take its place at the center of the moment. Lieutenant Rowan paused mid-stride, turning toward the sound. A subtle expression, half sorrow, half warmth, crossed his features. He stood with his hands behind his back, listening with the patience of a man who understood the value of silence shaped by music. Amos shifted to a higher register now, the notes lifting with a fragile brightness like wildflowers swaying in a morning breeze. The tune carried a gentle ache, nostalgia, hope, tenderness, all woven together into a sound that lingered long after each note faded. Emmett closed his eyes. The harmonica's voice stirred memories he hadn't visited in years. His mother's footsteps on creaking floorboards during early mornings. The sound of rain tapping on window panes as he drifted toward sleep. The warm hum of lullabies sung by neighbors during summer gatherings. The tune shifted again, falling to a lower, more grounded melody, steady and comforting. It matched the rhythm of Emmett's breathing perfectly, slow, deep, peaceful. When the final note finally drifted away, it dissolved into the quiet morning like mist lifting from the earth. Amos lowered the harmonica from his lips, breath gently unsteady, eyes soft and reflective. For a moment no one spoke. Then Morley exhaled with a low whistle. "You've got music in your bones, Amos?" Amos shrugged shyly. "Just something my father taught me. Figured today the land was quiet enough to hear it." Rowan stepped forward, offering a small nod. "That was beautifully done." His voice carried a warmth Emmett rarely heard. Music reminds us who we are, even out here. Amos lowered his gaze, cheeks warming with modest pride. Thank you, sir. As the group slowly dispersed, Emmett lingered a moment longer, letting the quiet settle around him again. The music had left a gentle imprint on the morning, an invisible ripple of warmth that made the trench feel less like a wound carved into the earth and more like a haven carved from hope. He touched the pocket watch in his coat, then the folded letter beside it, feeling both objects resonate with the music's lingering echo. In the soft brightness of the late morning, with the harmonica's final note still trembling faintly in his memory, Emmett felt something deep within him stir. A sense of being whole, even if just for a moment. As the morning moved gently toward midday, the trench continued to bask in its rare, peaceful warmth. The sun, no longer shy or veiled by mist, rose higher in the sky, casting soft light across the boards and stirring a quiet glow along the sandbags. Shadows softened, stretching lazily across the wooden planks like drowsy animals in no hurry to retreat. It was then that Emmett noticed a single sunbeam resting atop the parapet. It wasn't broad or dramatic, just a slender band of warm gold that slipped between two drifting clouds and settled on the edge of the trench wall like a visiting guest. The beam illuminated a small patch of sandbags and the worn earth beside them, making the damp fibers glisten as though threaded with faint silver. He paused his steps, letting the scene draw him closer. Everything the sunbeam touched seemed transformed. The droplets beading along the sandbags lit up like tiny stars, clinging to the coarse fabric. A strand of wire, previously dull and forgotten, gleamed with sudden brilliance. Even the uneven grain of the wooden board below shimmered softly, revealing textures he hadn't noticed before. Morley spotted Emmett staring upward and wandered over, curiosity written in the slight lift of his brow. "What's caught your eye?" Emmett nodded toward the light. "Just that. The way it landed there." Morley followed his gaze, then chuckled under his breath. "Doesn't take much to feel like a blessing these days, does it?" "Maybe blessings were always small," Emmett murmured, "and we just needed mornings like this to notice them." Lenton joined them a few moments later, squinting toward the parapet. "Feels like the sun's finally decided to say hello," he said with a grin. "Took it long enough?" Emmett smiled faintly, stepping a bit closer to the wall. The warmth of the beam brushed the back of his hand as he reached out to steady himself. It wasn't hot, just pleasantly warm, the kind of heat that felt like a quiet reassurance rather than a blazing demand. He lifted his hand slightly, holding it just inside the golden line. The warmth seeped into his skin, gentle as breath. He closed his eyes for a brief moment and let the sensation sink into him. Sunlight at the Somme often carried harshness, glare, dryness, the weight of long, exhausting days. But this warmth, this was softness, a quiet, comforting presence that wrapped lightly around his fingers and reminded him of summer mornings at home when the world smelled of grass and fresh bread and the distant sound of river water. Behind him, a few more soldiers noticed the way the light lay across the parapet. One of them paused mid-task, wiping his brow before offering a soft, almost childlike smile. "Funny," he said, "how one bit of sun can change the whole feel of a place." Rowan himself eventually approached, drawn by the small gathering, or perhaps by the same instinct that guided the men toward every gentle moment of the day. He stood beside Emmett, hands behind his back, gaze softened as he regarded the glowing section of the trench wall. "Nature knows how to offer comfort when we need it most," the lieutenant said quietly. Emmett glanced at him, Feels like the whole front's breathing easier today. Rowan nodded. The rain last night, the quiet, the music, and now the sun. He exhaled slowly, letting his shoulders drop a fraction. If we could bottle a morning like this, it would cure half the world's troubles. For a few moments, they all simply watched the sunbeam rest on the parapet. A bird landed briefly on a patch of exposed timber, fluttering its wings to shake loose the last droplets of rain. Its feathers glowed like tiny embers before it darted away again. As the sunshine warmed the trench, a subtle shift took place within the men, an easing of breath, a loosening of tension, a softening of hearts. Hope, fragile but persistent, flickered quietly among them like a flame sheltered from wind. Emmett eventually stepped back, letting someone else take his place in the sunbeam's gentle presence. As he did, he felt a brightness lingering in his chest, a warmth that didn't fade even when he moved into the shade. Some moments didn't need to last to make a difference. Some moments simply needed to be noticed. And this bright, slender sunbeam, resting on the parapet, felt like the world offering them a soft reminder. Even here, even now, light could still find its way through. The soft warmth of midday sunlight rested gently across the trench, warming coats, drying damp boards, and encouraging the last threads of mist to rise and fade into the brightening sky. The men moved with an easy rhythm now, their spirits subtly buoyed by the calmness that had settled over the Somme since the night's rain. Emmett had just finished helping Morley stack a few crates near a dugout wall when a distant clatter of boots sounded from the communication trench, a purposeful but unhurried stride. Heads turned, not in alarm, but in mild curiosity. A dispatch runner appeared moments later, his uniform muddied but his expression composed. A small satchel hung at his side, and strapped across his chest was a waterproof case, tightly sealed against the remnants of the morning damp. He paused to catch his breath, offering a polite nod to a few soldiers before continuing toward Lieutenant Rowan's shelter. "Message from the rear lines," he announced gently, his voice carrying just enough to reach those nearby. Rowan emerged from the command shelter with his usual calm demeanor, the lantern behind him casting a warm glow that contrasted with the bright midday light. He nodded to the runner, accepted the sealed case, and stepped aside to open it with measured care. The trench quieted, not in anxiety, but in quiet respect. Messages from the rear weren't always urgent. Often they were logistical updates, supply notes, or new schedules, but every message carried a small ripple of significance, like a pebble dropped into a still pool. Emmett remained where he stood, watching with mild curiosity as Rowan unfolded the thin, water-resistant paper inside. The officer's eyes skimmed the line slowly. His face didn't shift drastically, but Emmett saw something subtle, something almost like relief, soften the corners of his expression. Rowan folded the paper neatly and nodded to the runner. "Tell Captain Lewin I've received it. Thank you." The runner gave a brief salute and continued down the trench, disappearing into the maze of pathways. Several soldiers lingered nearby, waiting silently to hear whether the message contained anything that might affect their day. Rowan looked around at the small gathering, his posture relaxed, voice steady. "Good news," he said. "Supplies were delayed by the weather, but they've made it to the rear station. We'll have fresh medical kits, blankets, dry socks, and a few crates of preserved food by tomorrow morning." A murmur of relief swept through the men, soft, warm, grateful. Fresh supplies meant comfort. Dry socks meant protection from trench foot. New blankets meant warmth through the cold nights. Medical kits meant hope, on even the hardest of days. For soldiers whose lives often hinged on the smallest of necessities, such news felt almost luxurious. Morley let out a long exhale. "Dry socks," he said with exaggerated reverence. "That's the sort of heaven they never tell you about." Lenton nudged him. "You'll get your socks? Just don't wear holes in them on the first day." A few men chuckled quietly, the gentle humor weaving seamlessly into the sunlight. Emmett felt something soften inside him, a quiet gratitude he didn't quite know how to name. The steady flow of supplies wasn't simply about comfort. It was a sign of connection, a reminder that they were not forgotten, that somewhere beyond the long stretch of trenches and battered fields, people were still working to support them. Rowan folded his hands behind his back. "There's more," he continued, his voice lowering just slightly. "Weather reports indicate another light rain this evening, nothing heavy, but after last night." He paused, his gaze drifting upward as though listening to the air. "It may bring another calm." Another murmur, this one softer, touched with quiet anticipation. Emmett closed his eyes briefly. The idea of another gentle rain felt like a gift, something soothing, cleansing, almost sacred. Rain that did not harm, but healed. Rain that softened the land and the weary hearts upon it. Rowan dismissed the group with a nod. "Carry on, enjoy the daylight. We've earned a calm morning." As the men dispersed, Emmett approached Rowan with a respectful incline of his head. "Good news, sir." Rowan returned the nod. "We take what small victories we can, Harrow, and today gives us many." Emmett smiled, then turned back toward the main trench path, where the sunlight continued to rest warmly across the sandbags and the boards. As he walked, he felt the quiet reassurance of the message settle into his mind. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't life-changing, but it meant stability, care, continuity. A faint but important reminder that there was a world beyond this place, still turning, still sending them pieces of itself, warmth, supplies, reassurance, like gentle waves touching a shore. Sometimes messages didn't need to carry heroic news. Sometimes they only needed to say, "We remember you." And that was enough. The afternoon settled over the Somme with a softness so rare that the men almost didn't know how to wear it. The light had mellowed into a warm, honeyed glow that brushed the trench walls and softened every shadow, every edge. Even the wind had become gentle, drifting lazily through the pathways as if it too were weary and pleased to rest. Emmett found himself leaning against a sandbagged corner where the trench opened slightly into a broader crossing. From this vantage point, he could see a ribbon of sky overhead, blue now, pale and tender, carrying the promise of another peaceful evening. The boards beneath his boots had dried almost completely, leaving only faint patches of darker grain where moisture clung stubbornly. The air felt warmer, carrying traces of sun-warmed earth and faint hints of wildflowers from the small patch they'd discovered earlier. Morley wandered over, hands tucked into his pockets, shoulders relaxed in a way Emmett rarely saw. "Feels strange," Morley said softly, looking up at the sky. "A whole day with nothing pressing on our necks," Emmett nodded. "Strange, but good." Around them, the trench seemed to hum with a slow, contented rhythm. A few soldiers dozed lightly in shaded corners, helmets tipped low over their eyes. Others sat on crates or leaned against the walls, sharing quiet talk that rose and faded like soft waves. Some wrote letters home, their pencils scratching with gentle purpose across worn paper. Private Amos, the harmonica still tucked in his pocket, sat near the dugout entrance, humming faintly to himself, a soft, wandering melody that blended seamlessly into the afternoon air. Lenton appeared with a small tin cup of cooled tea, offering it with a slight tilt of his head. "Tea, anyone?" he asked. "It's hardly warm anymore, but the taste is still decent." Emmett accepted a sip, letting the mild, earthy flavor settle over his tongue. It wasn't much, but in the quiet of this peaceful afternoon, even a simple cup of tea felt like a kind gesture from the world. Above them, a drifting cloud passed slowly overhead, casting a gentle shadow that slipped along the length of the trench like a soft hand smoothing a rumpled sheet. The temperature dipped just slightly, creating a perfect balance between warmth and coolness, a comfort Mother Nature rarely offered so freely here. Lieutenant Rowan walked through the crossing with an unhurried stride. His eyes scanned the trench not with tension, but with quiet pride. He paused when he reached Emmett and the others. "Enjoying the calm?" Rowan asked. Morley grinned. "Trying not to get used to it, sir." Rowan allowed himself the smallest smile. "Perhaps let yourselves get used to it for today. Calm is a scarce commodity." He moved on, offering similar words to each small group he passed, encouraging them with nothing more than his calm presence and the grounding tone of his voice. Emmett inhaled deeply, feeling the afternoon air fill him with a rare lightness. The trench, so often tense with anticipation or shadowed by exhaustion, now seemed to carry a gentle stillness, an almost drowsy peace that sank deeply into the wooden beams and the muddy earth. Time slowed. Even the birds overhead moved lazily, as though cradled by the gentle air currents. A pair of sparrows fluttered down to perch on a rusted piece of wire, chirping softly before darting away again in playful arcs. Emmett let his eyes follow them, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Scenes like this, simple, fleeting, felt like gifts from another life, a reminder that beauty hadn't left the world. It had simply learned to hide in quieter places. Morley slid down to sit against the wall, stretching his legs. "If this keeps up," he said, "I might actually forget where I am." Emmett sank down beside him. "Maybe forgetting is part of healing. Or at least part of resting," Morley said with a quiet laugh. The warmth of the sun touched Emmett's shoulders, easing the tension from his muscles. His thoughts drifted slowly, light as dust motes floating in a sunbeam. He thought of the pocket watch in his coat. He thought of his sister's letter. He thought of the wildflowers blooming despite everything. And for the first time in a long while, his hopes didn't carry the weight of fear. They simply existed, soft, unhurried, like petals carried on an afternoon breeze. The trench around him pulsed gently with the same rhythm, steady, alive, at peace for this brief, blessed stretch of time. Sometimes the world did not need to shout to be heard. Sometimes it whispered. And in this gentle afternoon drift, Emmett felt the whisper settle in him, calming his breath. As the afternoon drifted on, a quiet lull wrapped itself around the trench, soft, steady, and almost dreamlike. The warm light fell gently over the men, settling into every fold of their uniforms, softening the lines of their faces. Time seemed to loosen its grip, stretching into something slow and unhurried. Emmett, still seated beside Morley, let his gaze wander over the trench. Some soldiers dozed, others spoke in quiet tones, but a few, scattered in small pockets of stillness, had taken out sheets of paper and pencils, writing slowly, thoughtfully, as though the afternoon itself had invited them to open their hearts. Morley noticed Emmett watching and nudged him lightly. "Ever write letters you don't send?" he asked softly. Emmett blinked. "What do you mean?" Morley shrugged, tilting his head toward the men with paper in hand. Some letters aren't meant for the post. Some are just meant for letting something out, I suppose. Emmett considered that. Have you written any? Morley chuckled, but there was something tender beneath the sound. Plenty. They'd probably laugh at me if they read half of them back home. Emmett tilted his head. Why not send them? Morley's eyes softened as he looked down at his hands. Some things aren't ready to be heard. Some things are just for the air. For me. For days like this. Emmett let that settle in his mind, like a small stone dropped into a still pool. A few yards away, Private Amos sat cross-legged on the boards, writing with careful strokes. His harmonica rested beside him, catching a sliver of sunlight. His brow furrowed as he paused between lines, but his face held no sadness, only a gentle depth, as though each word carried a small weight he was relieved to set down. Farther along, Linton leaned over a half-written page, his pencil tapping lightly against the paper. He stared at the words for a long time before adding a few more. Then, with a small sigh, he folded the letter carefully and tucked it, not into an envelope, but into the inside pocket of his coat. Emmett could almost feel the meaning behind the gesture. Letters for the heart. Letters for the quiet hours. Letters meant to lighten what could not be spoken aloud. A soft breeze drifted through the trench, lifting the edges of the papers, stirring dust motes that sparkled briefly in the sunlight. The afternoon warmth wrapped around the men like a blanket, encouraging honesty, gentleness, and reflection. Emmett reached into his coat and withdrew the letter from his sister. He didn't open it. He had already read it enough times to carry its words inside him. Instead, he let the folded page rest in his lap, its familiar weight grounding him. Morley glanced over. Thinking of writing one? Emmett hesitated, then nodded. Maybe. I'm not sure what I'd say. Doesn't matter, Morley said. Write what wants to be written. Leave the rest. Emmett thought about that. Slowly, almost shyly, he drew a spare piece of paper from a crate beside him and a pencil whose tip was worn, but still sharp enough to guide a thought. He looked at the blank page. The afternoon seemed to hold its breath for him. Then, with deliberate care, he wrote the first line, Dear Anna. His sister's name, simple, familiar, warm. He paused, letting the pencil hover. He didn't want to write about fear or danger or the weight that sometimes pressed on his chest before nightfall. Instead, he wrote about the rain, about the soft dawn, about the wildflowers blooming in defiance of the war, about the pocket watch he'd found and how holding it made him feel connected to someone he'd never met, about this peaceful day and how, strangely, he felt more like himself than he had in months. He wrote slowly, gently, the words unfolding like petals in the soft warmth of the afternoon. Around him, other men wrote their own truths, some long, some short, some meant for no one but themselves. The trench felt quieter than before, but it wasn't an empty quiet. It was a fullness, like the hush of a chapel or a library or a home after a long day, a sacred sort of stillness. When Emmett finally set down his pencil, he looked at the page. It wasn't finished, it wasn't polished, but it was honest, gentle, and real. Morley peeked at him. Better? Emmett nodded. Yeah, much. Morley smiled. Told you. Some things just need space. Emmett folded the letter, but not tightly. He didn't tuck it away. Instead, he held it loosely in his hands, letting the afternoon light settle across the paper. It didn't matter if he sent it. The truth had been spoken. The burden had grown lighter. Around him, the men breathed in quiet harmony, each one lifted slightly by the words they had given to the page. The gentle afternoon drifted on, soft, steady, healing in small, necessary ways. The afternoon sunlight deepened into a soft, golden warmth that draped itself across the trench like a comforting quilt. The earlier dampness had begun to release its hold on the earth, causing the air to smell faintly of warm soil and drying wood. With each passing hour, the scars left by the rain eased, puddles shrank, mud firmed beneath gentle heat, and slick boards grew safer underfoot. Emmett rose from where he'd been sitting, the unfinished letter still held loosely in his hand. He stretched his legs, feeling the pleasant stiffness that came from resting in a peaceful hour rather than from exhaustion. Morley remained seated on the crate, head tipped back, basking in the glow of the sun like a tired cat. Emmett stepped into the trench path and noticed something small but striking. Footprints, dozens of them, were drying slowly in the sunlight. Where the night's rain had softened the earth, the morning's tasks had shaped it. The impressions of boots, deep and waterlogged at dawn, were now sculpted into firmer outlines, each print telling a quiet story of movement, duty, companionship. Emmett crouched down to examine one of them, a crisp heel mark, the treads clear and detailed. It belonged to someone who had passed earlier, maybe Morley or Lenton or himself. He touched the edge lightly, feeling the warmth of the earth radiate into his fingertips. There was something deeply human about it. Evidence of presence, evidence of life continuing, evidence of steps taken deliberately, peacefully, in a world that often demanded urgency. A soft shuffle sounded behind him. Morley had wandered over, wiping his hands on his trousers. "Funny how footprints look different on a calm day," he said. Emmett glanced up. "How so?" Morley smiled faintly, lowering himself into a crouch. "Most days we leave them without noticing, just impressions in the mud. Today," he gestured around them, "feels more like, I don't know, like each step mattered." Emmett nodded slowly. "I think they always do. We just don't always feel it." Farther down the trench, other footprints formed a gentle choreography, some deep and steady, some lighter and quicker, some overlapping, in places where soldiers walked side by side. The sunlight cast soft shadows into their grooves, giving each one a quiet presence. Lenton passed by, pausing when he saw the two men crouched over the earth. "Don't tell me we're admiring footprints now," he teased gently. Morley gestured at the rows of impressions. "They look like a map of the day, a way to see how the trench has breathed." Lenton tilted his head, studying the prints with more attention. "Guess you're right," he admitted. "These here are mine from earlier, when I went to fetch water." He pointed to a set of heavier, wider steps. "Those are Rowan's. He has that firm way of walking." The three men stood in a small circle, tracing stories in the earth. The trench seemed to hum around them, the soft buzz of conversation, the gentle scrape of a shovel, the distant trill of a bird perched boldly on a piece of wire. Everywhere Emmett looked, he saw quiet life. A soldier leaning over a bucket, washing his hands with cool water. Another adjusting his coat, sunlight catching on a button. A pair of men sorting spare rations, laughing softly when a loaf slipped from their grasp. All of it recorded in the drying earth beneath their feet. Lieutenant Rowan approached at a leisurely pace. When he noticed the group observing the ground, he raised an eyebrow. "Something the matter?" Emmett stood brushing dust from his knees. "No, sir, just appreciating the peace." Rowan followed his gaze downward. For a moment his expression softened. Footprints endure longer on quiet days, he said. On days like this, they're not washed away immediately by rain or footsteps or other things. Morley nodded. Feels like they're proof we're still here, still living. Rowan's eyes warmed. Yes, proof of that. A gentle wind drifted through the trench, lifting a thread of dust, stirring the loose edges of coats and blankets. It felt warm now, not the cold gusts of the early morning, but the kind that carried promise rather than chill. Emmett stepped forward, leaving his own imprint in a patch of sunlit earth. He watched the shape form, clear, ridged, deeply set. He felt strangely moved by it. This, he murmured, feels like the earth remembering us kindly. Rowan offered a small nod. The land keeps its own quiet stories. And perhaps, Emmett thought, this peaceful day would become one of them, written softly in the soil, traced in footsteps, remembered in warmth. As the afternoon drifted onward, the trench glowed with the gentle imprint of lives lived in calm. It was a small thing, a simple thing, but it was real. And Emmett let that truth steady him. As the gentle afternoon settled deeper into its warmth, Emmett noticed a subtle shift in the air, so slight that at first he attributed it to nothing more than the natural easing of the day. But as he lifted his gaze toward the strip of sky visible above the trench, he saw it. Clouds, soft and low, drifting in from the west. They weren't dark or threatening. Instead, they carried the muted gray-blue of a quiet evening forming itself ahead of time. Wisps of vapor trailed behind them like feathered edges, blending seamlessly with the pale sky. It wasn't a sudden change, but a slow folding of a blanket being drawn gently toward the horizon. Morley, who had been leaning against a sandbag while humming absently, followed Emmett's line of sight. "Looks like we'll be getting that evening rain the lieutenant mentioned," he said softly. Emmett nodded. "A light one, probably. The kind that doesn't rush." Lenton overheard as he passed by and paused to squint at the sky. "Fine by me. If it's anything like last night, I'll take it. Rain doesn't feel so bad when the world's quiet." The thought settled warmly among them. As the clouds continued to gather, the sunlight softened into a muted glow that brushed across the trench like a fading memory. Shadows stretched longer now, leaning gently across crates and planks. The breeze shifted, becoming cooler, not sharp, but refreshing, carrying with it the distinct scent of coming rain. Earthy, familiar, filled with promise. Emmett inhaled deeply, letting the scent fill his lungs. It transported him instantly back to last night. The hush, the glistening lanterns, the raindrops tapping like soft fingers against metal and cloth. It had been a healing kind of rain, one that washed the world without taking anything from it. Now, as the afternoon edged slowly toward evening, the promise of another gentle shower felt like a quiet gift. Amos appeared from around the bend, a book tucked under his arm, his harmonica gleaming from his pocket. "Clouds are rolling in fast," he said with a thoughtful smile. "Maybe I'll play something soft before it starts." Morley grinned. "Only if you promise not to make us cry with it." Amos chuckled. "No promises." The men shared a warm laugh, low, unhurried, touched by the softness of the moment. Lieutenant Rowan approached from the far end of the trench, his steps measured but unburdened. He lifted his gaze toward the sky, studying the drifting clouds with a calm, knowing expression. "Evening rain," he confirmed quietly. "Light. Restful, I think." The way he said it made the men relax even more. Rain, in the lieutenant's tone, sounded less like weather and more like a lullaby the sky had decided to sing. He nodded once to Emmett. "If it comes soon, see that the canvas sheets are secured, but no need to rush. This storm won't hurry us." Emmett responded with a quiet, "Yes, sir," feeling no tension in the order, only the gentle preparation that matched the rest of the day. As Rowan moved on, the breeze picked up slightly, brushing across the men's coats and ruffling stray strands of hair. The trench seemed to respond in kind. Voices lowered, movements grew slower, as if everyone felt the world drawing itself inward in anticipation of a peaceful dusk. The sky dimmed subtly, not darkening, but softening, turning the pale blue of afternoon into the quiet silver of early evening. The wild flowers beyond the trench swayed in the cooling air, their petals fluttering delicately like small flags signaling the change to come. Emmett rested his hands on the top of a sandbag, tilting his face upward. A single drop of water touched his cheek. Cool, gentle, not heavy enough to fall with purpose, just the first quiet sign of what awaited them. He closed his eyes briefly. The air around him seemed to settle. A low murmur drifted from the trench as the men began to prepare. But even their readiness was slow and soothed by the peace of the day. Emmett opened his eyes again to watch the clouds move steadily across the sky, their billowing forms layered like folded cloth. It wasn't a storm. It was an evening arriving with softness, a reminder that nature, even after long months of turmoil, still wished to cradle them in calm. He felt his shoulders ease, his breath deepen, his heart steady itself against the quiet that had followed him all day. And as the first faint veil of gray brushed across the horizon, Emmett welcomed it. Sometimes the return of clouds meant more than rain. Sometimes it meant rest. As the clouds gathered into a silvery canopy overhead, dusk unfurled slowly across the length of the trench. The warm gold of late afternoon slipped away bit by bit, replaced by a cool, gentle lavender glow that touched the sandbags and timber with the softness of a fading lullaby. The quiet deepened, not out of fear, but out of a calm expectancy, as though the world itself were pausing before a sigh. Emmett moved along the trench with practiced ease, fastening canvas sheets into place where Lieutenant Rowan had instructed earlier. The fabric felt cool beneath his fingers, still holding a trace of the previous night's rain, but now smooth from the day's drying sun. Each knot tied into the ropes felt like preparing a small sanctuary, simple tasks that brought order to the dusk. Morley worked beside him, humming faintly under his breath as he secured the canvas with deft hands. "Feels like the rain's being polite this time," he said with a soft grin, "letting us get ready before it strolls in." Emmett chuckled. "After the day we've had, I think even the sky wants to be kind." Across the trench, soldiers moved with the same unhurried grace. Some pulled canvas awnings tighter, others checked that the duckboards were stable for the coming wetness. Amos perched on a crate with his harmonica resting in his hands, eyes lifted toward the clouded sky as though listening for the exact moment the rain would arrive. Lenton, stretching his back after setting the last rope in place, turned to watch the horizon. "Light's fading fast," he murmured. "Soon it'll be one of those evenings where everything feels softened." And indeed, the light was shifting, fading into deeper shades of violet and gray, blending into the quiet of the approaching night. The clouds hung low and broad, diffusing the last rays of sunlight into a cool, silvery sheen that touched the trench like a calm hand. Then it happened. A single drop, barely a whisper. It touched the brim of Emmett's helmet, rolling slowly down the metal surface before falling onto his sleeve and disappearing into the dark fabric. He looked up just as another drop landed, a soft tap on the wood beside him. Then another, and another. Not a patter, not a downpour. A beginning. "Here it is," Morley said quietly, almost reverently. The men around them stilled, listening. The rain arrived with the delicacy of a whispered secret. Each drop landed gently, spaced just enough apart that their sounds could be counted, soft, distant, like fingertips brushing the earth. It was not the insistent rain of a storm, but the tender kind that arrives slowly, allowing hearts to settle into its rhythm. Lieutenant Rowan appeared at the far end of the trench, his steps unhurried. He paused beneath a canvas sheet and listened as the first drops found their places on timber and tarp. His expression eased into a look of peaceful acceptance, almost gratitude. "Light rain," Rowan said softly, "just enough to cool the evening." The air cooled noticeably, becoming fresh and scented with earth, wood, and the first hints of night. Emmett closed his eyes as the misting drizzle brushed his face. The droplets felt wonderfully calm, each one a tiny reminder of the serenity they had been gifted over the past hours. The trench seemed to transform again under the rain's gentle touch. Lanterns glowed more warmly as dusk thickened. The boards glistened faintly, reflecting small patches of light. Conversations quieted into soft murmurs as though everyone instinctively lowered their voices in respect for the settling night. Amos lifted his harmonica but didn't play, choosing instead to listen. The rain provided its own music, delicate and rhythmic, weaving a lullaby through the sheltered spaces of the trench. Morley sighed contentedly. "I could sleep standing up with rain like this." "Wouldn't be the first time," Lenton replied with a quiet laugh. Emmett breathed deeply. The scent of fresh rain, petrichor blended with cool air, filled his senses. It carried memories of home, of quiet evenings on porches, of warm blankets and soft conversations. But here, in the trench, it carried something even more precious, the promise of rest. He leaned lightly against the sandbag wall, letting the rhythm of the falling droplets settle into his bones. A soft tap, a gentle patter, a sighing hush. The first drop had welcomed dusk, and now the rain began to compose its evening song. The rain deepened only slightly as night settled over the Somme, never rising to a storm, only to a soft, steady murmur that wrapped the trench in a blanket of cool serenity. The sky darkened into a velvety shade of blue, nearly black, but the clouds glowed faintly with the last whispers of dusk, diffusing the lantern light into a gentle halo that hovered in the air like floating embers. Emmett walked slowly along the trench, his steps unhurried, his breath calm and deep. The boards beneath him gleamed with a thin sheen of rain, reflecting the soft lantern glow in shimmering lines that wavered whenever a drop disturbed them. The world felt quieter than it had in months. No distant thunder of artillery, no harsh shouts, no sudden clatter of urgency. Just rain, just breath, just peace. He paused beneath a canvas overhang where Amos sat tuning his harmonica, though he didn't intend to play tonight. "Sometimes silence is the song," Amos murmured when Emmett glanced his way. Emmett nodded, feeling the truth of it settle warmly in his chest. Morley and Lenton shared a blanket near a lantern, their conversation low and drowsy. Someone had boiled water earlier, and the faint scent of warmth still lingered as steam drifted lazily from a tin resting on a crate. A few men wrote final lines in their unsent letters. Others simply watched the falling rain, mesmerized by its rhythm, soothed by its ordinary magic. Lieutenant Rowan passed by, checking on each man, not out of duty, but out of quiet concern. When he reached Emmett, he gave a small nod. "Good work today," he said softly. "All of you." His voice carried that calm steadiness that had been their anchor through the night, the morning, the afternoon, and now the gentle rain of evening. Emmett felt something warm unfold inside him. "Thank you, sir. It was a good day." Rowan lifted his gaze toward the sky, listening to the delicate patter on the canvas. "Days like this remind us that the world can still be gentle," he said, "and that gentleness is worth holding on to." He moved on, boots making soft impressions in the damp earth, footprints that glistened in the lantern light, before settling quietly into the night. Emmett leaned back, letting the rain's hushed lullaby settle over him like a soft blanket. The trench, for all its scars, felt like a sanctuary tonight, washed clean, quieted, softened. Every man within it seemed held by the same peaceful lull. A small cluster of wildflowers near the far wall, those delicate blossoms they'd discovered that morning, were now bowed slightly under the rain, their petals glistening like tiny jewels. Yet even as they bent, they never broke. Their quiet resilience mirrored everything Emmett had witnessed across this long, gentle day. He reached into his coat and touched the pocket watch he had found. The quiet story of another life pressed close to his heart. With his other hand he rested his fingers on the folded letter he had written, but not yet finished. 2 pieces of hope, side by side. 2 reminders that humanity lived even here, even now. The rain softened again, becoming so light it was almost a mist. Emmett exhaled, long and slow, feeling the day settle into memory. A day of peace, a day of small wonders, a day where the Somme, against all odds, remembered how to be gentle. The lanterns flickered in the calm breeze. The men eased into rest. The night breathed around them, no longer heavy but soothing, like the deep inhale before sleep. Emmett closed his eyes. Tonight, the rain had washed the world clean, and for the first time in a very long while, he felt ready to dream. Thank you for spending this quiet, tender journey with us, walking beside Emmett and the men through a rare day of peace along the Somme. I hope a gentle rain over the Somme brought calm to your evening, softened the weight of your day, and offered you a space to breathe deeply. If you enjoyed this story and would like to rest with more peaceful narratives, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment below. Tell me where you're watching from, whether it's late at night in the U.S., early morning in Europe, a soft evening in Canada, or anywhere else in the world. Your words and presence here truly matter. Now let your thoughts drift like mist over quiet fields. Let your breath slow. Let your body grow heavy with rest. The night is gentle, you are safe, and sleep is waiting to welcome you. Good night.